Hey there, and welcome back. If you are lying in the dark now, with the long day folded away behind you and the house gone still, then there is nothing more for you to do tonight, nothing to carry and nothing to mend. Only to let your breathing slow and let the warmth gather around you, and let me take you a long way from here. Tonight we are going back almost 600 years into the windswept and candlelit world of the late Middle Ages, to follow the life of a man who began as a servant in another man's house and ended as the founder of the most famous royal dynasty England has ever known. He was a Welshman of broken fortune, born into a conquered people, a man with no money and no power and no prospect of either, who came into England to earn his bread in service. And there, against every law and every expectation of his rigid age, he did the most dangerous and impossible thing a man in his position could do. He fell in love with a queen, and she with him, and in secret, hidden from the whole watching world, the servant and the queen were married. From that forbidden marriage, made in the shadows by two people who had no business loving each other, there came in time a line of kings, the House of Tudor, the dynasty of Henry and Elizabeth, that would shape England for more than 100 years. And the man himself, the Welsh servant at the root of it all, would live to be old, and would die at last on a scaffold in a market square, an old man kneeling for the axe. Still loyal to the line his own blood would one day inherit. His name was Owen Tudor, and tonight his whole strange and daring life is ours to wander through. Slowly, from a hall in windy Anglesey to a queen's bedchamber to a block of wood in a Hereford street, where a woman would set candles burning around his severed head, and there is nothing for you to remember. For the names and the years will drift past you like smoke, and somewhere in the telling you will fall asleep. And that is exactly as it should be. Before we set out together, let me say one quiet thing to you, the one who has chosen to spend these dark hours here, in this old and vanished world, rather than anywhere else. If you find, somewhere along the way tonight, that this has done what it came to do, that it has loosened the grip of the day and carried you down gently towards sleep, then you would be most welcome to stay a while in this company, to let this be a place you come back to on the nights when rest is slow in coming and the dark feels long. There is a small and simple way to do that, with the button beneath this, and it asks nothing of you and only lets me know you would like to find your way back here again. And if you have a moment before you drift, I would love to know where in the world you are listening from tonight, and what the hour is where you lie, the city or the village or the quiet country dark. The rain on the glass or the snow on the sill or the still warm air of summer, for these messages reach me from every corner of the earth, from people lying just as you are lying now, and I look through them, every one, and they are among the truest pleasures of these long nights. But all of that can wait. For now there is only the wind off the sea, and a Welshman of fallen fortune, and the astonishing life that lies before him. Picture this. It is the turn of the 15th century, and we are on the island of Anglesey, in the far northwest of Wales, a low green island lying across a narrow strait from the great mountains of Snowdonia, with the cold grey sea on every side. It is a hard and a beautiful country, a land of wind and rain and slate-grey stone, of small fields won from the moorland, of scattered farms and timber halls, of a people who speak their own ancient tongue and remember, with a fierce and unforgotten pride, that they were once free. For this is a conquered land. Little more than 100 years before, the last native princes of Wales were destroyed by the armies of England, and the country was bound beneath the English crown, ringed with the stone castles the conquerors had razed to hold it down. The Welsh live now as a subject people in their own country, taxed and governed by foreigners, shut out from the towns and the offices and the honours of the land, nursing the memory of their lost freedom. And in one of the timber halls of this island, among a family that had once stood high among the Welsh and had fallen by the turning of events into reduced and dangerous circumstances, a boy is growing up. a boy of quick wits and strong body, and no fortune at all, who carries in his veins the blood of the old Welsh nobility, and not a penny to his name. Imagine the world of that boyhood, for it was a time far from the gilded palaces where his life would later carry him. The hall in which he grew was a building of timber and stone, a long room with a fire burning in the centre of the floor, and the smoke finding its way out through a hole in the roof. The walls hung perhaps with a few weapons and a woven cloth or two, the floor strewn with rushes. Here the household gathered for its meals, the family and the servants and the dependents together, eating the plain fare of the Welsh uplands, oat bread and cheese and salted meat, butter and milk, and the flesh of their own beasts. Outside lay the hard small farms won from the moor, the cattle that were the true wealth of the Welsh, the wind off the sea, and the rain sweeping in across the strait from the mountains. In the evenings by the firelight there would have been talk and song, the old tales told and retold, the praise of ancestors, the lament for the lost freedom of Wales, the music of the harp that the Welsh loved above all instruments. It was a hard life, and a poor one by the measure of wealth, but it was rich in other things, in kinship and memory and poetry, in the deep belonging of a people to their land and their past. And it bred a boy who, for all his poverty, knew himself to be the heir of seneschals and the kin of princes, and who carried that knowledge and that pride out of the windy island and into the wide world. There is a curious thing about his very name worth pausing on, for it carries a small history of its own. In the Welsh way, a man bore no fixed surname, but was named as the son of his father, who was the son of his father before him, so that Owen was Owain, son of Maredudd, son of Tudor. His identity, a little chain of fathers reaching back into the past. When such a man came into England, where fixed surnames were the rule, something had to be done with this string of Welsh names, and the English, seizing on one of them, fixed upon the grandfather's name, Tudor, and turned it into a surname, anglicised into Tudor. And so a Welsh given name, the name of Owen's grandfather, became, almost by accident, the name of a man, and then the name of his sons, and at the last, the name of the most famous royal dynasty in English history. The House of Tudor took its name in the end, from the grandfather of an obscure young man of Anglesey, whose name was plucked from a Welsh patronymic and made into the surname of kings. It is a small thing, but a telling one, the Welsh root, showing through the English crown, the name of a forgotten islander, carried by the strangest of roads onto the throne of England and into the memory of the world. His name in the Welsh fashion is Owain, the son of Maredudd, the son of Tudor, and the world he is about to walk into will know him, in time, as Owen Tudor. This is where his story begins. To grow up Welsh in those days was to grow up inside a way of life, very old and very different from the England that ruled over it. The Welsh were a people of the uplands and the valleys, herders and small farmers who knew every stream and standing stone of their country, bound together not by towns and trade, but by kindred and by the deep memory of shared descent. They reckoned a man not by his wealth, but by his blood, tracing their lineages back through father and grandfather and great-grandfather into the heroic past. And a poor man might carry in his head the names of 20 ancestors and the honour of belonging to an ancient line. They kept their own law, older and gentler in some ways than the harsh law of England. And above all, they kept their own language and their own poetry, for the Welsh loved verse as few peoples ever have. In the halls of the gentry sat the bards, the trained poets who bore the history and the praise of the great families in elaborate and beautiful verse, singing of heroes and battles and the lost glory of the Welsh princes, keeping alive in song the memory of the days before the conquest. This was the world that shaped Owen, a time of kinship and lineage and poetry, of green hills and grey rain, and the long ache of a freedom lost, and he carried its mark upon him all his life. The proud Welshman among the English, the son of a conquered and a singing people. He would have bore his Welshness with him into the English court like a hidden country he held within himself. His first language was Welsh, the ancient tongue of the Britons, and though he must have learned to speak English and French to make his way, he would have thought and dreamed in Welsh, and carried in his memory the poems and the proverbs and the long pedigrees of his people. He would have known himself always as a man apart in the English world, marked by his speech and his name and his blood as belonging to a conquered and a suspect race, and that sense of difference, of being an outsider who must make his way by his own gifts in a world not made for him, would have sharpened both his ambition and his charm. There is something fitting, then, in the fact that this proud Welsh outsider, who bore his lost country within him, should have founded a line that would one day come home to Wales under the Red Dragon and be welcomed as deliverers. The Welshness that set Owen apart and held him down became, 2 generations later, the very factor that helped to carry his grandson to the throne. And Wales remembered. The Welsh have long memories, kept alive in song and story, and they did not forget that the dynasty which came to rule England had sprung, through Owen, from Welsh blood and the line of the old princes. To the Welsh, the triumph of the Tudors was in some sense their own, the fulfilment of the ancient hope that one of their blood would rise to rule the whole island. And the bards sang the praises of the new royal house and traced its descent back through Owen to Ednyfed Fycon and the princes of Gwynedd. It was a strange and a satisfying reversal for a conquered people that the blood of their old nobility, driven low by the English conquest, should rise at last to wear the English crown. And at the root of it stood the poor Welshman who had carried the line of Penmynydd into a queen's bed. The conquered blood would conquer in the end, and the song of the bards, sung over the ruined fortunes of Penmynydd, would prove to be a true prophecy after all. And the coming of the Tudors did, in time, change things for Wales itself. Not all at once, and not in every way for the better, but truly. Under the dynasty of Welsh descent, the harshest of the old penal laws that had so galled Owen's youth were swept away, and the Welsh were admitted, in time, to the rights and the offices and the citizenship that had been denied them, made equal in law with the English at last. Welshmen flocked to the court of the Tudor kings, finding there a welcome and an advancement that their fathers could never have known, and the old wound of the conquest, while it did not vanish, was eased by the knowledge that the line itself sprang from Welsh blood. It was a strange and a fitting vindication of all that Owen had been and suffered, that the disabilities which had driven him out of Wales to seek his fortune should be lifted by the dynasty his own blood had founded, that the conquered people from whom he sprang should find, under his descendants, a measure of the dignity the conquest had stripped away. The poor Welshman, barred by law from the towns of his own country, became the grandfather of the kings who opened those doors to his people. There is a justice in that deeper than any the men who beheaded him could have imagined. The long, slow righting through his own line of the very wrongs that had shadowed his beginnings. To understand the man Owen Tudor became, you must first understand the wound at the heart of the country that bred him, for Wales in his day was a land living under defeat. For centuries the Welsh had been a free people, ruled by their own princes, fierce in the defence of their mountains, and though the kings of England had pressed at them again and again, the Welsh had held their high country against all comers. But in the end, the weight of England proved too great. The last of the native princes was killed, his head held in mockery to London, and the whole of Wales was bound fast beneath the English crown, its freedom broken, its rulers gone. To hold the conquered land, the English king raised a ring of vast stone castles around the coasts and the river mouths, the mightiest fortresses in all of Britain, their grey walls a permanent reminder to the Welsh of who now ruled them. These castles were among the wonders of the age, enormous works of stone raised at vast expense to pin down a conquered people, with their high curtain walls and their massive round towers, their gatehouses bristling with defences, their harbours where ships could supply them from the sea. They were built deliberately near the Welsh towns, often with new English settlements planted beside them, walled boroughs from which the Welsh were excluded, so that the conqueror's power stood always visible above the daily life of the subject people. To grow up in their shadow, as Owen did, was to live with the permanent stone reminder of defeat, to see every day the grey towers that said, more plainly than any words, that Wales was subdued and would be held. They were meant to break the Welsh spirit as much as to defend the land, to make the conquest feel eternal and resistance hopeless. And for generations they did their work. Yet there is an irony in them too, for these same castles, raised by England to hold Wales down, would one day open their gates to Owen's grandson as he marched through Wales toward his crown, the conqueror's fortresses welcoming home the deliverer of the vanquished. The stones that had been a symbol of Welsh subjection would witness, in the end, the triumph of Welsh blood. And within that ring, the Welsh lived as a subject, people governed by English law and English officers, their own customs pushed to the margins, the better positions and the walled towns reserved for Englishmen and settlers. It was a proud people brought low, living daily with the memory of what they had lost, and that memory, that long ache of defeat, was the air that Owen Tudor breathed from his cradle. His own family, though, were no common Welsh folk, for the house into which he was born had once stood very near the summit of Welsh society. They were the family of Penmynydd, a line of the old Welsh aristocracy, and they traced their descent from a man named Ednyfed Fichan, who had been the seneschal, the great steward and right hand of the native princes of Gwynedd in the days of Welsh freedom. Ednyfed Fichan was a name to conjure with in that part of Wales, a hero of the old days whose memory the family kept burnished with pride. He had served the greatest of the native princes as his chief minister and counsellor, the man who ran the prince's household and led his armies and guided his affairs, holding in the small Welsh world a place not unlike that of a great minister of state. From him, the family of Penmynydd descended in an unbroken line, and they held by inheritance from him lands and privileges that marked them out as men of the first rank among the Welsh gentry. To belong to that line was to belong to the very aristocracy of native Wales, the families who had stood closest to the lost princes, who carried in their blood the dignity of the old free Wales that the conquest had destroyed. Owen grew up steeped in this inheritance of pride, hearing the praise poems that the bards made for his family, knowing the long roll of his ancestors, conscious that for all his present poverty he was no common man, but the heir of seneschals and the kin of princes. It was a strange and a painful inheritance, this proud memory of greatness set against the hard reality of a ruined and disabled present, and it bred in Owen, as in many of his kind, a fierce ambition to restore by his own efforts something of the dignity that his family had lost. He would restore it in the end, beyond anything his proudest ancestor could have imagined, though by a road that none of them could have foreseen. For generations, the descendants of Ednyfed had held lands and offices and honour, serving the princes, and then, after the conquest, holding their place as leading men of their part of Wales, the kind of family that mattered in the affairs of the island. They were gentry of ancient blood, conscious of their lineage, proud of a pedigree that ran back into the heroic age of the Welsh princes. So Owen was not born a peasant. He was born into a family with a name and a long memory, a family that had known power and position, and that pride of blood, that sense of belonging to something old and honourable, would stay with him all his life, even when the family's fortunes had been smashed almost to nothing, and smashed they had been by a catastrophe that fell upon his house in the very years of his birth. That catastrophe was the Great Revolt of Owen Glyndwr. In the first years of the 15th century, a Welsh nobleman of royal descent named Owen Glyndwr raised the banner of revolt against English rule, and for a time it seemed as though the freedom of Wales might be won back. The whole country rose. Glyndwr was proclaimed Prince of Wales. He summoned parliaments. He dreamed of a free Welsh nation with its own church and its own universities, and for a decade the revolt blazed across the land. And the family of Penmanid, Owen's own kin, threw themselves into the rising. His relatives, the leading men of his house, were among Glinda's chief supporters, fighting for the dream of a free Wales. But the revolt, after years of struggle, was ground down and crushed by the power of England. Glyndwr himself vanished into the mountains and was never taken, but his followers paid a terrible price. Before its long defeat, though, the revolt had blazed with a brightness that the Welsh would never forget, and it is worth pausing on the dream it carried, for that dream would one day be fulfilled in a strange and roundabout way, through Owen's own grandson. For a few extraordinary years, Glyndwr had been more than a rebel. He had been proclaimed Prince of Wales by his followers, had summoned parliaments of his own at Welsh towns, had planned an independent Welsh church free of the Sea of Canterbury, and had dreamed of 2 Welsh universities to school his people in their own land. He had made treaties with France and with the enemies of the English king, and for a heady moment it had seemed that the clock might be turned back, that a free Wales might rise again from the ashes of the conquest. There ran through the revolt, too, an old strand of Welsh prophecy, the ancient belief that one day a deliverer would come, a son of prophecy, a deliverer of the Welsh nation who would cast off the English yoke and restore the glory of the Britons. Glyndwr had seemed, to many, to be that promised deliverer. This belief in a coming deliverer ran deep in the Welsh soul, far older than Glyndwr, reaching back through centuries of bardic prophecy. The poets of Wales had long sung of a Mab Darogan, a son of prophecy, a hero of the old British blood, who would one day arise to drive out the foreign rulers and restore the Welsh to their ancient glory and their lost sovereignty over the whole island of Britain. Through all the long generations of defeat and subjection, this hope had been kept alive in the verses of the bards. A flame of national longing passed from one age to the next. The promise that the wheel would one day turn and a Welsh deliverer would come. Glyndwr had bore that hope for a time, and when he failed, the hope did not die but waited, looking for the one in whom it would at last be fulfilled. And here is the strange and beautiful thing that gives Owen's story its deepest resonance, for that fulfillment, when it finally came, would come through Owen's own blood. The son of prophecy the bards had sung of for centuries would prove to be Owen's grandson, the boy Henry, a man of Welsh descent who would land in Wales, rally the Welsh to his banner under the red dragon of the old British kings, and win the throne of all England, fulfilling at last, in a way no one could have foreseen, the ancient dream of a Welsh deliverer. The prophecy that Glyndwr had failed to fulfill would be fulfilled against all expectation by the grandson of a Welsh servant. But the dream was broken on the hard power of England, and the lands of the rebels were seized, their houses ruined, and upon the Welsh as a whole there fell a set of harsh penal laws, stripping them of rights, barring them from offices and from the towns, treating the whole people as suspect and dangerous. These penal laws were a heavy and a humiliating yoke, and it is worth understanding their weight, for they shaped the narrow world from which Owen had to escape. By their terms, a Welshman could not hold any office of authority in his own land, could not become a citizen of the walled towns where trade and prosperity were concentrated, could not buy land in those towns or marry into the English families that held them, could not bear arms freely or gather in numbers without leave. An Englishman bringing a charge against a Welshman could be sure of the law's favour, while a Welshman seeking justice against an Englishman would find the courts closed against him. The whole apparatus of the law was bent to keep the Welsh down, to mark them as a defeated and a dangerous race who must be denied the means of rising. For a man of spirit and ability, born to such disabilities, the future at home was a narrow and a galling thing. Every road to advancement barred by the simple fact of his birth. It was a powerful spur to a man like Owen, this sense of being shut out in his own country, and it goes far to explain why so many of the ablest young Welshmen of his day looked beyond the borders of Wales for the chance to make something of themselves, seeking in England, or in the wars in France, the opportunities that their own disabled land could never give them. We should feel the particular sting of it for a man of Owen's pride and lineage. To be poor was hard enough, but to be poor and barred by law from the ordinary roads out of poverty, barred not for anything he had done, but simply for the blood he carried and the people he belonged to, was galling and bitter indeed. He could see, all around him, the prosperity and the advancement open to Englishmen, the offices and the trade and the security that the law reserved for the conquering race, and he knew himself shut out from all of it by an accident of birth. For a proud young man conscious of his ancient lineage, the heir of seneschals reduced to a future of narrow poverty by laws that branded his whole people as suspect, the injustice must have burned. It was the sort of trial that could break a man, souring him into bitterness and despair, or it could drive him, as it drove Owen, to a fierce determination to rise above the bounds his world had set, to prove himself worthy of more than his birth allowed. The penal laws meant to keep the Welsh down. In Owen they helped to forge a man hungry enough and daring enough to climb higher than any law could reach. The family of Penmanid, which had backed the losing side, was broken by the defeat, its lands lost, its standing destroyed, its men scattered or dead or living under suspicion. And it was into this wreckage, into a great family fallen from greatness in the ruin of a failed rebellion, that Owen Tudor was born. So the boy grew up in the long shadow of his family's disaster, a child of fallen fortune in a defeated land. He had the blood of the old Welsh nobility in his veins, and the pride that went with it. But he had almost nothing else. No lands worth the name, no money, no position, and the penal laws hanging over him simply for being Welsh and for belonging to a family that had risen against the crown. He grew up, we may suppose, hearing the old tales of his family's greatness in the days before the fall, of Ednyfed the seneschal and the princes he served, and at the same time living the hard, narrow reality of a young Welshman with no prospects in a country where his people were shut out from advancement. It was a galling position for a boy of spirit and ambition, to carry a proud name and a proud lineage, and yet to face a future of poverty and obscurity, hemmed in on every side by the disabilities laid on his race. A man in such a position had few choices. He could stay in Wales and sink into the reduced life that was all his ruined family could offer, or he could do what ambitious Welshmen had always done when their own country had nothing to give them. He could go to England, into the very heart of the power that had conquered his people, and try to make a fortune there in service. And that, in the end, is the road that Owen Tudor took. The journey itself, from the far northwest of Wales into the heart of England, was no small undertaking in that age, for travel was slow and hard and often dangerous. The roads were poor, little more than tracks worn by feet and hooves, winding through a countryside of forest and moor and fen, where a lone traveller might go for miles between villages, and where robbers haunted the wild places. A man setting out from Anglesey would have crossed the strait from his island, passed beneath the shadow of the great English castles that ringed the Welsh coast, and made his way eastward over the mountains and through the marches, the border country, into England proper, a journey of many days on foot or on a hired horse. He would have carried little, a poor young man seeking his fortune, perhaps a letter of introduction if he was lucky, perhaps only his wits and his strong body and the memory of his family's lost greatness. And he would have come at last into the wider, richer, more crowded world of England, so different from the windy uplands of his home. The busy towns, the great houses, the bustle of a kingdom at the height of its power. It was a long road from the timber hall in Anglesey to the household of a queen, and Owen walked the first hard steps of it as a poor Welshman with nothing but his hopes. leaving behind the conquered land of his birth to seek his fortune among the conquerors. How exactly the young Owen made his way from a ruined family in Anglesey into the service of the English crown is not certainly known, for he was a man of no importance then, and no one troubled to record the early steps of a poor Welshman's career. And here we must be honest about how little of Owen himself has come down to us, for it shapes the whole way his story must be told. We do not know the year of his birth for certain, nor the names of all his children, nor the place or the manner of his secret wedding, nor 100 other things we should dearly like to know. Above all, we have no true likeness of him, and no words of his own, save the single sentence he is said to have spoken at the very end. We are told he was handsome and graceful and charming, but we cannot see his face or hear his voice across the centuries. He comes to us, this man at the root of a great dynasty, as a figure half in shadow, glimpsed in the bare records of grants and pardons and accusations, his inner life and his very appearance lost to time. It is the common fate of those who begin low, even when they rise high, that the early years go unrecorded and the private man is lost behind the public events. We must reconstruct Owen, then, from the shape of his deeds, from the daring of his choices and the loyalty of his death, and let the actions speak for the man whose face and voice are gone. But the broad path is clear enough, and it was a path that many of his countrymen followed. Wales, for all that it was a conquered and a disabled country, bred hardy and capable men, and the English crown, forever at war with France in those years, had constant need of soldiers and servants. A Welshman of good blood and strong body, even one under the shadow of the penal laws, could find a place in the household of some lord or in the armies that crossed the sea to fight in France, and by loyal and able service might slowly raise himself from nothing. Service in that age was the great ladder by which a man without land or money might climb, and it was nothing to be ashamed of. A powerful lord's household was a small kingdom in itself, a community of dozens or hundreds of people, from the high officers who managed his estates and his finances down through the squires and ushers and grooms to the humblest kitchen boys. And to hold a place in such a household, even a modest one, was to have a roof and a livelihood, and far more importantly, a chance. A capable and an agreeable man who attached himself to a powerful master, who made himself useful and won his lord's trust, could rise through the ranks of the household, gather rewards and responsibilities, catch the eye of still greater men, and so climb, by patient degrees, toward real fortune. Many a career began in just this way, in the lowly service of a great house, and many a man who ended his days as a knight or a landed gentleman had begun as a servant in another man's hall. For a Welshman shut out by the penal laws from the ordinary roads to advancement, this world of service offered one of the few open doors, and Owen, with his good blood, his strong body, his quick wits, and his easy charm, was well suited to walk through it. He had the gifts that service rewarded, the ability to please, to be useful, to make himself liked and trusted, and he set out to make his fortune by them. These were not small gifts, though they are easy to undervalue. The ability to make oneself genuinely liked, to put others at their ease, to be useful without being servile and charming without being false, is a rare and a precious thing, and it is the foundation on which many a career has been built. Owen had it in abundance. There was a warmth in him, a liveliness, a natural grace of manner that drew people to him and made them want to help him on. He could turn his hand to many things, sing and dance and ride and fight, carry himself well in any company, find the right word and the right manner for every situation. In a time where a man without birth or fortune had to make his way by pleasing the powerful, these social gifts were as good as gold, and Owen spent them well, rising by them from obscurity into trust and responsibility. And it was these same gifts, in the end, that won him a queen, for it was his warmth and his charm and his grace, far more than any beauty or strength, that drew the lonely Catherine to him. The qualities that had carried the poor Welshman up through the ranks of service were the very qualities that a love-starved queen found irresistible. Owen rose first and last by the simple human gift of being someone people wanted near them. Owen, it seems, took this road. He entered service, attached himself to the household of men of power, and very likely saw something of the wars in France, where the armies of the young English king were carrying all before them in those triumphant years. The England he came into was a country at the very summit of its medieval glory, drunk on victory and conquest. Its king, Henry V, was the most admired warrior in Christendom, a man who had taken a small English army deep into France and against overwhelming odds had shattered the flower of French chivalry at the Battle of Agincourt, a victory so complete and so astonishing that it rang through all of Europe. In the years that followed, Henry had pressed his advantage, conquering wide stretches of France, taking its cities one by one, until he had forced the French king to make him heir to the throne of France itself and to give him the hand of his daughter. It was a tide of triumph such as England had rarely known, and the whole realm rang with the glory of it, with the spoils and the ransoms and the renown of the French wars. For an ambitious man seeking his fortune, it was a time of opportunity, for war on such a scale needed men, soldiers, and servants and officers without number, and a capable fellow who threw in his lot with the king's cause might win advancement, plunder, and a name. Owen, like many of his countrymen, was drawn into the great enterprise of the French wars, into the service of the crown at the height of its conquering pride. He cannot have known that the glory was a brittle thing, that the great king would soon be dead and the conquests would slip away, and that his own destiny lay not on the battlefields of France, but in the quiet household of the king's young widow. He learned the ways of the English court and the English camp, learned to make himself useful and agreeable, and rose by slow degrees from an obscure Welsh servant into a trusted member of a household. The campaigns in France would have been a hard schooling for a young man, for war in that age was a grim and a wearing business beneath its banners and its glory. There was the long marching through hostile country, the cold and the hunger and the sickness that killed far more soldiers than the enemy's blades ever did, the dull misery of siege work, the sudden terror of battle. A young Welshman in the king's armies would have seen the realities behind the songs of chivalry, the burned villages and the plundered towns, the suffering of the common people on whom the armies fed, the brutal arithmetic of ransom and pillage by which men made or lost their fortunes in war. He would have learned hard lessons about survival, about the value of a strong arm and a cool head and a useful skill, about how a man without birth or wealth might yet make himself valued by his courage and his competence. And he would have learned, too, the ways of the great, observing at close hand the lords and captains he served, absorbing the manners and the bearing and the speech of the powerful, the knowledge that would later let him move with such ease in a queen's household. The wars in France made Owen, in many ways, the man who would win Catherine, hardening him, polishing him, teaching him the world, before fortune took him to the strangest posting of his life. It was a modest enough achievement, the quiet advancement of a capable man, and there was nothing in it to suggest the extraordinary destiny that lay ahead. But it carried him, step by step, toward the household where his whole life would change. That household was the household of the Queen. For in those years, the King of England was Henry V, the great warrior king, the victor of Agincourt, who had conquered much of France and forced its king to make him heir to the French throne. And to seal that conquest, Henry had married the daughter of the French king, a princess named Catherine of Valois, a young woman of beauty and grace who had come to England as its queen. But the warrior king's glory was brief. Henry V died young, struck down by sickness while still on campaign in France, leaving his queen a widow at barely 21, with an infant son not yet a year old. That infant became, by his father's death, King of England, and within weeks, by the death of his French grandfather, King of France as well, a baby crowned over two kingdoms. It was a strange and a perilous thing. A kingdom ruled in the name of a child who could not yet speak, and it shaped the whole world in which Owen and Catherine moved. For where a king is an infant, real power passes to the men who govern in his name, and the long years of a child king's minority were years of jostling and intrigue among the royal uncles and the lords. Each manoeuvring for advantage, each guarding his own power and watching his rivals. The realm was held together, more or less, by the counsels of these magnates, but beneath the surface ran constant currents of ambition and faction. And into this watchful and suspicious world, the Dowager Queen and her affairs were drawn, whether she wished it or not. A queen who might remarry, who might through a new husband gain influence over her royal son, was a factor the powerful men could not ignore. And so Catherine lived under their careful eyes, valued and constrained, a piece on the board that others wished to control. It is against this backdrop of a child king and his quarrelling guardians that the secret love of Owen and Catherine must be understood. A private warmth, kindled in the cold and watchful world of a minority government. A thing of the heart growing quietly amid the calculations of power. And Catherine, the young French princess, found herself in a strange and lonely position, a widowed queen in a foreign land, the mother of the king, but with no authority of her own, set aside from the government of the realm, which was held by the magnates who ruled in the baby king's name. She was young, she was beautiful, she was royal, and she was profoundly alone. A widow in her early 20s, surrounded by a watchful and suspicious court that wished to keep her quiet and harmless. Her position was, in truth, a strange and a delicate one, for a dowager queen was both precious and inconvenient to the men who ruled the realm. She was precious because she was the mother of the king, a person of the highest dignity whose honour reflected upon the crown itself. But she was inconvenient because she was young and might wish to live, to love, to marry again. And any such desire on her part threatened to introduce some new and unwelcome element into the careful balance of power. The lords who governed for her son wanted her to be a kind of living monument, dignified and idle, and above all harmless. The honoured mother of the king, with no will or wishes of her own. They did not want her to be a woman with a heart and a body and a longing for happiness. And yet that, of course, is exactly what she was, a woman in the fullness of her life, full of the unmet hungers of a loveless past, fenced in by ceremony and watched by suspicious eyes, but alive and longing beneath all the royal dignity for the simple human warmth she had never known. It was a position full of quiet desperation, and into it walked Owen, and the rest, as they say, followed. And it was into the household of this lonely young dowager queen that Owen Tudor, the Welsh servant of fallen fortune, now came. We should pause on Catherine herself, for she is the other half of this story, and to understand Owen's life, we must understand the woman he came to serve. She had been born a princess of France, a daughter of the royal house of Valois, but her childhood had been anything but happy. Her father, the King of France, was mad, sunk for long stretches into a terrible insanity in which he did not know his own family, and her mother was a worldly and neglectful queen. So that Catherine and her brothers and sisters had been raised in want and disorder amid the chaos of a broken court and a country torn by civil war. The court of her childhood had been a place of nightmare beneath its surface of splendour. Her father, the King of France, suffered from a madness that came and went in terrible fits, during which he did not know his own wife or children, believed himself to be made of glass, and had to be restrained from harming himself and others, while the government of the kingdom fell into the hands of quarrelling factions of princes who fought one another for power, even as the English pressed at the borders. In the disorder of that broken court, the royal children were sometimes neglected to the point of real want, left short of food and clothing and care, while the great ones pursued their feuds. Catherine grew up then, not in the security one might imagine for a princess of France, but in fear and uncertainty and intermittent poverty. The daughter of a mad king and a careless queen, a child shaped by instability and longing. It is no small thing to understand this, for it explains much about the woman she became and the choices she would make. A girl raised in such coldness and chaos, married off as a pawn of policy, and then widowed and set aside, would carry within her a deep hunger for the simple human warmth her exalted life had never given her. That hunger, unmet through all her royal years, was the soil in which her love for Owen would one day take root. Out of that grim childhood, she had been married at 20 to the conquering King of England, as the living seal of England's victory over her own country, and carried off to a foreign land to be its queen. And then, almost at once, she had been widowed, left with a baby and a crown that was her son's and not her own. A stranger in England, with no real place. She was a woman who had never been allowed to choose anything in her own life. Married for policy, used as a token, set aside when her usefulness as a royal womb seemed done. And now, still young, still lovely, still full of the longing for affection that her cold and broken life had never satisfied, she presided over her own household, a quiet establishment of servants and attendants, the gilded and lonely retirement of a dowager queen. Among those servants was Owen. The life of a dowager queen was a strange suspended thing, comfortable and empty at once. Catherine wanted for nothing in the way of material things. She had her houses and her servants, her revenues and her fine clothes, the dignity and the deference owed to the mother of the king. But she had no purpose and no power, and very little freedom. The government of the realm was firmly in the hands of the great lords, who ruled for her infant son, and they had no intention of allowing the king's mother any voice in affairs or any independent role. She was watched, gently but constantly. Her movements noted, her associations observed. For a dowager queen was a piece of value on the board of the kingdom, and those who held power meant to keep control of her. So she lived in a kind of golden idleness, presiding over a household that had little to do, surrounded by attendants who treated her with ceremony but offered her no true companionship. A woman in the flower of her life, with nothing to fill her days but the empty forms of royal dignity. It was a lonely existence, for all its comfort, the loneliness of a person of high rank kept carefully useless, and into that loneliness, day by day, came the warm and capable Welshman who managed her household, the one person in her gilded cage who treated her, beneath all the proper deference, as a living woman rather than a royal relic. Owen's place in the Queen's household was a position of trust, though its exact nature is, like so much of his early life, uncertain. By the accounts that come down to us, he held an office in the management of her household, perhaps the keeper of her wardrobe or the master of her household. One of those responsible and intimate posts that placed a man in daily contact with the Queen and the running of her domestic world. It was a good position for a Welshman of his background, a sign that he had risen by his ability and his agreeable manner into real responsibility, and it gave him something more precious than wages. It gave him nearness. Day after day, in the ordinary running of the household, Owen was in the Queen's presence, attending to her affairs, seeing to her comfort, moving through the intimate domestic spaces of her life. To grasp how their love could grow, you must picture the daily intimacy of a noble household which threw together, in constant proximity, people of the most different stations. The officer who managed the Queen's household was no distant figure, but a man at the very centre of her domestic world, responsible for the ordering of her chambers, the provisioning of her table, the management of her servants. the smooth running of all the small business of daily life. Such a man would be in the Queen's presence many times a day, receiving her instructions, attending to her wishes, present at her meals and her entertainments, a constant and a familiar figure moving through her rooms. The very nearness of it, the daily seeing and speaking, the shared concern for the running of her life, created a kind of intimacy that the formal gulf of rank could not entirely prevent. He came to know her moods, her tastes, her loneliness. She came to rely on him, to look for him, to find in his warm competence a comfort her formal attendance could not give. And out of that daily nearness, that constant low intimacy of a household shared, the forbidden bond slowly grew, not as a sudden blaze, but as the quiet deepening of a familiarity into something neither of them, perhaps, had meant to allow. The household that placed a servant so near a queen had made their love almost possible by its very design. He was, by every account, a handsome man, well-made and graceful, with the easy charm that had carried him up from nothing, and he could sing and dance, and carry himself with a natural grace that belied his humble station. There is a tradition, much repeated in the old tellings, that Owen first truly caught the Queen's eye at a dance, where leaping or turning with too much vigour, he stumbled and fell, by some accounts, into the Queen's very lap, and that this moment of accident and laughter first drew her warm attention to him. Whether or not the tale is true in its particulars, it captures something real about the man and about how he won her. For it was by his liveliness, his physical grace, his warmth, and his good humour that Owen drew people to him. And a queen starved of laughter, and life would have felt that pull as strongly as anyone. He was, by every account, an unusually attractive man, well-made and handsome, light on his feet, quick to smile, with the natural easy charm that had took him up from nothing. And he had, beneath the charm, the deeper qualities that make a man worth loving and not merely admiring, a steadiness, a courage, a capacity for devotion that his whole later life would prove. To Catherine, surrounded by cold and formal attendants and the watchful agents of the leading lords, this warm and graceful and devoted Welshman must have seemed like the only truly alive person in her gilded prison. He brought laughter into her empty days, and tenderness into her loveless life, and looked at her with a man's frank admiration rather than a courtier's careful deference. It is not hard to see how a lonely widow came to love him. The wonder is not that she did, but that, loving him, she found the courage to act upon it against the whole weight of her realm. And Catherine, the lonely widow starved of warmth and affection, living among formal attendants who treated her as a royal ornament to be guarded, found in her Welsh servant something she had found nowhere else in her cold and managed life. She found a man who was warm and alive and near, and who looked at her, not as a token of policy or a royal womb, but as a woman. What grew between them in the quiet of that household was the most dangerous secret in the kingdom. The love that grew between the Queen and her servant was a thing that, by every rule of their world, should never have been allowed to happen, and could never be openly confessed. The gulf between them was almost beyond measuring. She was a daughter of the royal house of France, the widow of the greatest king in Christendom, the mother of the reigning king of England, a woman of the very highest blood in Europe. He was a Welshman of a conquered and disabled people, a servant in her household, a man with a great pedigree, but no lands and no rank and no money, hedged about by the penal laws laid on his race. For such a woman to love such a man was, in the eyes of their age, almost unthinkable. A scandalous overturning of the whole natural order of rank and degree. And yet love does not consult the tables of precedence. The lonely young queen and the warm and graceful Welshman, thrown together day after day in the intimacy of her household, came to love each other truly and deeply, and they faced, in that love, a terrible choice. They could deny it and live apart, the queen sinking back into her gilded loneliness and the servant into his obscurity. Or they could reach for it and risk everything, for if their love were known, it would bring the wrath of the whole governing power of the realm down upon them both. They chose, in the end, to reach for it. And in choosing, they set in motion a chain of events that would change the history of England. It is worth dwelling on the sheer scale of what they dared, for there can have been few loves in all of history that crossed so wide a gulf. The whole architecture of their time was built upon rank and degree, on the iron conviction that every person had an appointed station, fixed by God, and that the orders of society were as distinct and as unbridgeable as the orders of angels. A queen and a servant were not merely far apart in wealth or fashion. They belonged, in the thinking of the age, to different kinds of being. The one of the highest king's blood, anointed and exalted, the other of the common clay, born to serve. For such a pair to love was to defy not only the law of the land, but the whole settled order of the universe, as their age understood it. To insist that the heart knew a truth deeper than rank. That a queen and a servant were, beneath their stations, simply a woman and a man who might love each other. There is something quietly revolutionary in that, something that reaches across the centuries to us. For it is the assertion that love is no respecter of degree, that it leaps the highest walls the world can build. Owen and Catherine made that assertion not in words, but with their lives, and paid for it with danger and grief, and in Owen's case, with death. But they made it, and the fruit of it changed a kingdom, and there is a kind of grandeur in their daring that no scaffold could ever diminish. Their story has earned its place among the love stories of the English past, set beside any of the famous romances of history, and it has a quality that many of those grander tales lack. The quality of being true and human and unguarded. This was no courtly fable of knights and ladies, no idealized romance polished for the telling. It was a real love between two flesh and blood people, a lonely woman and a charming man, who found each other across an impossible divide and dared to seize the happiness the world forbade them. There was nothing grand about how it began. A queen drawn to the warmth of a servant who loved his mistress, the oldest and simplest of human stories. What made it extraordinary was not its beginning, but its daring and its consequences. The courage to defy a kingdom and the dynasty that sprang from the defiance. And perhaps that is why it has lasted, why it still moves us across the centuries, because beneath the crowns and the scaffolds and the founding of dynasties, it is, at heart, a simple story of two people who loved each other when they were not supposed to, and would not let the world's rules stand in the way of their hearts. There was, moreover, a hard and specific law standing in their way. For the rulers of the realm had foreseen, in a general way, the danger of a dowager queen remarrying. A widowed queen was a valuable and a dangerous prize. If she married again, her new husband might gain, through her, a dangerous influence near the throne, a connection to the royal blood, and a foothold in the affairs of the kingdom. This was no idle fear. For the recent history of England held a cautionary tale that the lords had not forgotten. Not so very long before, another dowager queen, the widow of an earlier king, had taken a second husband of no great rank, and the consequences had caused lasting trouble and resentment. The new husband and the children of the second marriage becoming a source of faction and dispute. The lords who ruled in the infant king's name were determined that no such thing should happen again, that the king's mother should not become, through some unsuitable marriage, the means by which an ambitious man might worm his way into the royal family and the affairs of state. A dowager queen was a gateway to the throne, and whoever married her stepped, through her, into a dangerous nearness to the crown. And so they had made their law, hedging the Queen's remarriage about with the requirement of royal consent precisely to keep that gateway locked. To ensure that if Catherine married at all, she married only where it suited the policy of the realm. The law was aimed at exactly the danger that Owen now represented. An obscure man of no rank, who by marrying the Queen would become the stepfather of the king and the husband of a woman of the very highest birth. That the man in question was a Welsh servant only made the offence, in the eyes of the lords, the more outrageous, and their fury, when the truth came out, the more certain. And so, to guard against this, the great men who ruled in the young king's name had caused a law to be made, a statute declaring that the Dowager Queen might not marry again without the formal consent of the king and his council, on pain of grievous penalties for any man who dared to wed her without that leave. It was a law aimed precisely at a situation like the one now unfolding, designed to keep Catherine safely unmarried, or to marry her only where it suited the policy of the realm. And the consent of the king and council would never, in 1,000 years, have been given to a match between the Queen and a penniless Welsh servant. The law, in other words, made their love not merely scandalous, but criminal. For Owen to marry Catherine without leave was to break the statute and to expose himself to ruin, imprisonment, even death. There was no lawful path to their union. If they were to be together, it could only be in secret, in defiance of the law and the council and the whole power of the realm. There was, however, one strange door left open to them, and it lay in the nature of marriage itself as the Church then understood it. For in that age the Church held that what made a marriage was not the permission of kings or councils, not a grand ceremony or a public proclamation, but simply the free consent of the two people themselves, a man and a woman of age and free condition, declaring before God that they took each other as husband and wife. A marriage made so, even in secret, even with no witnesses, and no priest, and no record, was held by the Church to be a true and binding marriage in the eyes of God, however much it might offend the law of the land. These clandestine marriages, as they were called, were frowned upon and forbidden and punished, and they caused endless trouble and dispute. But they were, when truly made, valid. And this meant that Owen and Catherine, though they could never win the consent of the king and council, could still bind themselves to each other in a marriage that God and the Church would recognize, simply by their own free declaration. It was a marriage the law of the realm would call a crime, but it was a marriage all the same, real and sacramental, and their children would be, in the eyes of the Church, legitimate. That narrow door, the Church's insistence that consent alone made a marriage, was the gap through which their forbidden love could pass into something binding and true. And that is exactly what they did. At some point in the late 1420s, in circumstances so secret that no record of it survives, Owen Tudor and Catherine of Valois were married. There was no public ceremony, no announcement, no entry in any register, nothing to mark the most extraordinary marriage of the age. It was done in the shadows, witnessed by a few trusted souls, if by anyone at all, and then hidden from the time. The Queen of England, the mother of the king, had married her Welsh servant in flat defiance of the law that forbade it, and the secret had to be kept at all costs, for its discovery would mean catastrophe. Think of the daring of it. The sheer reckless courage of two people defying the entire structure of their world for love. She risked her position, her honour, the wrath of her own son's government. He risked his liberty and his life. For the law could fall on him with terrible weight. And yet they did it, quietly, secretly, binding themselves together as husband and wife in the sight of God, if not of the law, and then living out their marriage in hiding. A queen and a servant playing the parts of mistress and man before the world, while being, in truth and in secret, wife, and husband. It is one of the great hidden love stories of English history, and almost nothing about it can be known for certain, precisely because it was so well concealed. And yet, for all the secrecy that surrounded it in its own day, the story did not stay buried. It survived and grew, and became one of the cherished legends of the English past, told and retold across the centuries, embroidered by later ages with details and dialogue that the bare records never held. The tale of the Queen who fell for the dance of a Welsh servant, of the secret marriage and the hidden children, of the prison and the scaffold and the candles in the marketplace, proved too good and too moving to be forgotten. And it passed into the storehouse of national legend, retold by chroniclers and poets and historians down the generations. Each age found in it what it wished to find, romance or daring, or the wonder of the low raised to the high, or the strange workings of Providence that brought a dynasty out of a servant's love. The very gaps in the record, the things that cannot be known, gave the story room to grow, and the figure of Owen Tudor, glimpsed so faintly in the documents of his own time, loomed ever larger in the telling, the romantic founder of a royal house. So the secret that two people guarded so carefully in their own day became, in the end, one of the best-loved stories of their nation. A thing whispered in the shadows transformed into a legend told in the lights. For the marriage once made had to be lived in the shadows, and the children of it borne away from the watching eyes of the court. Catherine withdrew as much as she could from the centre of things, living quietly in her own houses away from the palaces, and there, in that hidden domestic life, she and Owen made a family. Children were born to them, several children, raised in secret in the Queen's private establishment, far from the court, that would have been scandalized to learn of their existence. There were sons, chief among them two boys, named Edmund and Jasper, who would one day rise to heights their secret birth could never have promised, and there were other children besides, of whom less is known. For some years the secret held. The Queen and her Welsh husband lived their hidden marriage, raised their hidden children in a quiet domesticity utterly unlike the cold formal loneliness of Catherine's life before, and for a while they had what they had risked everything for: a true marriage and a real family and the warmth of a shared life. It could not last, of course. A secret so great, involving the mother of the king, could not be kept forever in a world of watching eyes and whispering tongues. But for a few precious years, the servant and the Queen lived as husband and wife, and in those secret years the seed of the House of Tudor was sown. Those secret years of their marriage are, in a way, the sweetest and the most mysterious part of Owen's whole story. For they were the years in which he had everything and the time knew nothing. Picture the strangeness of it. Here was a Welsh servant who by any outward measure was still merely an officer of the Queen's household, a man of no rank moving about her domestic affairs. And yet in secret he was her husband, the father of her children, the partner of her life, sharing her bed and her board and her private hours, living a married life of real intimacy and affection in the very midst of a court that would have been horrified to know it. They lived, as much as they could, away from the great public palaces, in the Queen's own manors and houses in the countryside, where the watching was less constant and a secret could more easily be kept. These country houses of the Queen were the setting of the happiest years of Owen's life, and we may let our minds rest a moment on what that hidden domestic world was like. They were comfortable manor houses set in their own lands away from the royal palaces and the crowded court. Places where a household could live quietly through the turning of the seasons, with their halls and chambers and gardens, their farms and orchards, their own small worlds of servants and tenants. In such a place, far from the watching eyes of the council, the Queen and her Welsh husband could live for long stretches, almost as an ordinary married couple of the gentry might live, rising and dining and walking and sleeping under the same roof, raising their children, keeping the rhythm of country days. There would have been the ordinary domestic pleasures that the greats so rarely tasted, the meals taken together, the evenings by the fire, the children underfoot, the small shared business of a household. All the homely things that Catherine had never known in her cold royal life, and that Owen, the servant, could give her more truly than any king. It was a stolen happiness, lived always under the shadow of discovery, and it could not last forever. We should not imagine those years as wholly carefree, for the strain of the secret must have lain upon them always, a quiet fear beneath the happiness. A marriage so dangerous, so utterly forbidden, could be kept hidden only by constant care, and every servant who knew, every confidant who shared the secret, was a thread that might one day unravel the whole. They could never relax entirely into their happiness, never forget that discovery might come at any time, that the wrath of the council might descend upon them without warning. There was a watchfulness, then, woven through their domestic peace, a need to dissemble before the wider world, to play the parts of queen and servant while being, in truth, wife and husband, to guard their words and their glances when others were near. It was a happiness lived on borrowed time, in a kind of beautiful and perpetual danger, and that danger must have sharpened their tenderness even as it shadowed it. The way a thing held precariously is held all the more dear. They had snatched their love from a world that forbade it, and they kept it only by vigilance and luck and the loyalty of those few who knew. That they kept it as long as they did, that they made a family and a home in the teeth of such danger, is a measure of their courage and their care. But the shadow was always there, and in the end the secret broke, as such secrets must, and the danger they had lived with so long became, at the last, the ruin they had always feared. But for those few years, in the quiet manor houses of the English countryside, a queen of France and a servant of Wales lived a hidden married life of real and ordinary tenderness, and were, against all the odds of their impossible situation, a family. What each gave the other in that hidden marriage is worth a moment's thought, for it was a true exchange of the things they most lacked. To Catherine, Owen gave warmth and tenderness, and the simple human love that her cold royal life had never known. The ordinary happiness of a shared home and growing children. The experience of being loved as a woman and not used as a piece of policy. After a childhood of neglect and a marriage of state, and the empty loneliness of her widowhood, she found in her Welsh husband the one thing all her royalty had never given her, a person who loved her for herself. And to Owen, Catherine gave a love and a trust beyond any servant's dreaming, and with it a family and a future and a place in the world that lifted him out of his obscurity into the very heart of the kingdom's life. But more than these material gifts, what they gave each other was simply each other, two lonely people who had each been used by the world for the time's purposes, finding in one another a refuge and a home. Theirs was not the grand passion of romance, but something quieter and perhaps deeper, the settled love of two people who had found, against all the odds, the one bond each had been missing. It lasted only a handful of years before her death tore it apart, but in those years they had what kings and queens so rarely have, a true and tender marriage, and it was worth, to both of them, everything it cost. There, in those quieter places, the Queen and her Welshman could be for hours and days at a time, simply a husband and wife with their growing children, a family like any other, the rigid order of the realm forgotten behind closed doors. It was a domestic happiness that neither of them had known before. Catherine starved of warmth all her cold royal life. Owen lifted out of his obscurity into a love beyond any servant's dreams. and they guarded it fiercely. This fragile, hidden happiness, knowing how easily it could be destroyed. For those few years, the most unlikely couple in England lived a quiet, married life in the shadows, and were by every sign content. The children born of this hidden marriage were the living proof of it, and two of them would matter enormously to the history of England. The eldest, or among the eldest, was a boy named Edmund, and after him came a boy named Jasper, and these two, Edmund and Jasper Tudor, would in time be the bridge by which their father's blood reached the throne. There was at least one more son, a boy who would grow up to take holy orders and live out his life quietly as a monk, withdrawn from the world. And there may have been a daughter or other children who did not survive, or of whom history kept no clear record. The two who mattered, Edmund and Jasper, would prove to be very different men, and both remarkable in their way. Edmund, the elder, would grow into a proud and capable young nobleman, conscious of his royal half-blood, ambitious to make his mark, the one through whom the line to the throne would run. Jasper, the younger, would prove to be something rarer and finer, a man of unshakable loyalty and dogged courage, not brilliant perhaps, but utterly steadfast, the kind of man who holds to a cause and a kinsman through every disaster and never lets go. Between them, in time, they would carry the whole future of their father's line, Edmund as the father of the king to come, Jasper as the protector who would guard that king through the long years of exile and bring him home at last. There was, besides these two, another son, a quieter soul, who would turn away from the world and its ambitions altogether and take holy orders, living out his days as a monk at Westminster, withdrawn into prayer while his brothers played their parts on the dangerous stage of the world. There is something quietly affecting in the thought of this third son, the one who chose the cloister over ambition. While Edmund reached for greatness, and Jasper gave his life to loyal soldiering, this brother turned away from ambition altogether, seeking in the quiet of the monastery the peace that the perilous life of his family could not offer. Perhaps he had seen enough of the perils that royal blood brought, the prison and the scaffold that had touched his father, the wars that would claim so many. Perhaps he simply felt the call of God more strongly than the call of the time. Whatever the reason, he lived out his days in prayer and study within the abbey walls, a monk among monks, far from the battles and the intrigues that consumed his brothers. He would outlive the worst of the wars, and end his days in the quiet he had chosen. And there is a kind of wisdom in his choice that the bloody fates of so many of his kin throw into sharp relief. Not every child of that extraordinary marriage was made for greatness or for war. One, at least, found a quieter path, and kept it, while the storms of the age broke over the heads of his more ambitious brothers. It is a curious thing to think of, the three sons of the Queen and the servant taking such different roads. One toward a crown he would never wear, but would pass to his son. One toward a lifetime of loyal soldiering. One toward the cloister and the silence of God. But all of that lay ahead. In the hidden years they were simply children, the secret sons of a secret marriage, growing up in the quiet country houses, unaware of the storms that waited for them and the destiny that their very existence carried. But it is Edmund and Jasper who matter, the two sons of the Queen and the servant, half-brothers, through their mother, to the King of England himself. For consider the blood that ran in these boys. On their mother's side, they were grandsons of the King of France and the nephews of kings, carrying the king's blood of Valois, and half-brothers to King Henry VI of England, who shared their mother. On their father's side, they were the sons of a Welsh servant of fallen fortune, carrying the ancient but ruined lineage of Penmanid. They were, by their very existence, a scandalous impossibility, the half-royal children of a secret and unlawful marriage. And yet they were also, by that same blood, very near indeed to the throne of England. What was to become of such children, born in secret to a queen and a servant, no one could say. For the present, they were simply Owen and Catherine's hidden sons, growing up in the quiet of the Queen's private houses, and knowing of the storms that lay ahead. But a secret of that magnitude could not be kept forever, and in time the truth came out. Exactly how the marriage was discovered we cannot say with certainty, but discovered it was. And when it became known that the Dowager Queen of England, the mother of the king, had secretly married a Welsh servant and borne him a family of children, the scandal was enormous. A secret of that magnitude, involving so many people over so many years, the births of several children, the servants who must have known, the houses where the family had lived, could never have been kept forever. And one imagines that the truth had been suspected and whispered long before it was openly acknowledged. Perhaps it was the sheer number of the children that made concealment impossible at last. Perhaps some servant talked, or some enemy pieced the truth together. Or the Queen's withdrawal from court and her long absences in the country drew suspicious eyes. However it came out, the effect was a thunderclap. The mother of the King of England, a princess of the royal house of France, had given herself in marriage to a Welsh nobody, a servant of her own household, a man of a conquered and disabled race, and had borne him children, in flat defiance of the law of the realm. To the proud lords of the council, it was almost beyond belief, an outrage against the dignity of the crown and the order of society, and a direct breach of the very statute they had made to prevent it. Their first instinct was to contain the damage, to separate the Queen from her unsuitable husband, and to deal with the presumptuous Welshman who had dared so much. And then, in the midst of their reckoning, the whole situation was transformed by the Queen's sudden decline. To the great lords who ruled the realm, it was an outrage and an embarrassment of the first order, a defiance of the law they had made, a stain upon the dignity of the crown. A Welshman of no account, presuming to wed the king's own mother. The reaction was harsh and immediate. The powers of the realm, and in particular the proud and ambitious uncle of the king who dominated the council, were furious, and they moved to break up the marriage, to punish the presumptuous Welshman, and to bring the Queen back under proper control. Owen, who had dared so much, now found the full weight of the offended state turning against him. The quiet happiness of the hidden years was over. The secret was out. The scandal had broken. And the servant who had married a queen was now a marked man, exposed to the wrath of the most powerful men in England, with nothing to shield him but the love and the rank of his royal wife. And that shield, as it turned out, was about to be taken from him. For in the midst of the gathering storm over their discovered marriage, Catherine fell ill. The Queen who had survived a mad father and a broken childhood, a marriage of policy and an early widowhood, who had found at last a secret happiness with her Welshman, sickened and weakened, and in the early days of the year 1437, died. She was still a young woman, not much past 35, and her death, coming just as the scandal of her marriage was breaking over them, was a catastrophe for Owen of the first magnitude. She had spent her last illness withdrawn and ailing in an abbey, her body and her spirit worn down by sickness and by the strain of the breaking scandal, and her life ended as sorrowfully as much of it had been lived. She was buried with the honours due to a queen, laid to rest among the kings and queens of England in the Abbey of Westminster. The French princess who had been the wife of one English king and the mother of another, and the secret wife of a Welsh servant. Her death was a release from the storm that was breaking over her marriage, but it was bought at the price of her life, and it left the man she had loved terribly exposed. While Catherine lived, Owen had some protection, for however angry the lords might be, he was the husband, secret or not, of the king's own mother, and to destroy him outright was to insult the dead king's widow and the living king's parent. But with Catherine gone, that protection vanished utterly. Owen was now simply a Welsh commoner who had broken the law by marrying the Queen, a man with no rank and no powerful friends, his royal wife dead, his children's future uncertain, and the full anger of the realm's rulers free to fall upon him without restraint. He had lost, in a single blow, the wife he loved, and the only shield that stood between him and ruin. The lonely, hunted, dangerous years of his life were about to begin. The man who now turned his power against Owen was the most formidable figure in the realm. Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, the younger uncle of the boy king and one of the dominant powers in the government. Gloucester was proud, ambitious, and jealous of the dignity of the royal house. And the discovery that his nephew's mother had secretly married a Welsh servant of no account was to him an intolerable affront that demanded punishment. He was a man of great gifts and great flaws. This duke, the youngest of the royal brothers, a patron of learning and a collector of books who would leave a famous library to posterity, but also a restless and a grasping politician, forever scheming for power, forever at odds with rivals, a man whose ambition outran his judgment. He had spent his life jostling for control of the government, and he guarded the dignity and the interests of the king's family with a fierce and a personal jealousy. To such a man, the secret marriage of the king's mother to a Welshman was not merely a scandal, but a personal insult, a defilement of the sacred blood he set such store by, and an offence against the law and the order he claimed to uphold. His pursuit of Owen had in it, one suspects, something more than cold policy, a real and personal anger at the presumption of the thing. Yet the wheel of fortune that lifted and dropped men so freely in that age would not spare the proud duke either. In time Gloucester himself would fall from power, brought down by his enemies, and would die in custody under a shadow of suspicion, his own end as sudden and as grim as any he had designed for others. The duke who had hounded the Welsh servant did not, in the end, outlast him by so very much, and Owen lived to see his great enemy fall. With Catherine dead and her protection removed, Gloucester moved swiftly against him. The Welshman was summoned to come before the council to answer for his conduct, an alarming command for a man in his position, for he could have no illusions about the fate that might await him at the hands of his enemies. Owen, no fool, understood the danger, and at first he took refuge in sanctuary, in the precincts of the wealthy Abbey of Westminster, where by the ancient custom of the church a fugitive could not be seized. Sanctuary was one of the strange and merciful institutions of the medieval world, a survival of the old belief that holy ground offered a refuge that no secular power might violate. A man pursued by the law, or by his enemies, or by the wrath of the powerful, could flee to a great church or its precincts and claim the protection of God, and there, within the sacred bounds, he could not lawfully be seized or harmed. Westminster, the great abbey beside the king's own palace, held one of the most famous and most jealously guarded sanctuaries in the realm, and within its precinct gathered, at any time, a strange population of fugitives, debtors fleeing their creditors, men accused of crimes, others who had simply made themselves dangerous enemies, all sheltering under the protection of the holy ground. It was a refuge, but also a trap of a kind, for a man in sanctuary was safe only so long as he stayed within the bounds, and could not pursue his affairs or live his life in the wider world. For Owen, sanctuary at Westminster was a desperate measure, a sign of how grave his danger was. That the husband of the late Queen should be reduced to sheltering among the fugitives of the Abbey precinct, and it could only ever be a temporary refuge. Sooner or later, he would have to come out, or be coaxed out, into the reach of the enemies who waited for him, and the assurances of safe conduct that drew him forth would prove, as he had feared, to be worth very little. There he sat, safe for the moment within the holy ground, while messengers tried to coax him out with assurances of fair treatment. He was wary, and rightly so, suspecting that any promise of safety was a trap to draw him out of sanctuary and into the hands of his enemies. For a time, he held out within the abbey walls, but the pressure was relentless. And in the end, whether trusting to a promise of safe conduct or judging that he had no other choice, Owen left the protection of sanctuary and came to present himself before the king and council to answer the charges against him. It was, as he had feared, a kind of trap. Owen put up a spirited defence of himself, and remarkably, in his first appearance, he seems to have made his case well enough that no clear crime could immediately be fixed upon him, and he was, for the moment, allowed to go, but his enemies were not done with him. No sooner had he set out to return to Wales than he was pursued, seized, and brought back, and this time he was thrown into prison. The place of his confinement was Newgate, the grim and notorious jail of London, a foul and dangerous place where the Welshman who had dared to marry a queen was now locked away at the pleasure of the lords who hated him. Imprisonment in a place like Newgate was a grim and a perilous fate, for the medieval jail was nothing like a modern prison with its rules and its rations. It was a foul and crowded den, dark and stinking, where prisoners were thrown together in squalor and where jail fever and other sicknesses carried off the weak with fearful regularity. A prisoner's comfort, even his survival, depended heavily on his own resources, for the keepers extracted payment for every easement, for better food, for lighter irons, for a less wretched cell, and a man without money or friends to supply him might fester and die in the dark. Worse than the physical misery, for a man in Owen's position, was the uncertainty, the not knowing whether he would be released or left to rot, or taken out one morning to the block. His fate hanging entirely on the will of the powerful men who had put him there and who wished him gone. To sit in such a den, an honoured man fallen so low, the secret husband of a queen, reduced to a prisoner in a London jail, was a bitter trial of the spirit, and many a stronger seeming man than Owen had been broken by far less. That he endured it, and more than endured it, that he kept his nerve and his resolve and bent his whole hardy will toward escape, tells us much about the toughness that lay beneath his easy charm. He was not a man to die quietly in the dark, and he did not mean to. It was a steep fall from the secret husband of the Queen of England to a prisoner in Newgate, and it showed how completely Catherine's death had stripped him of protection. He was a commoner again, and a hunted one. His royal marriage, now a crime to be answered for rather than a shield to hide behind. In the cold of his cell, he must have wondered whether he would ever come out alive, whether the enmity of Gloucester would carry him all the way to the scaffold, and whether the children he had made with Catherine would ever be safe. For a man who had risen so high in secret, the prison of Newgate was a bitter place to come to rest. But Owen Tudor was not a man to sit quietly and await whatever fate his enemies designed for him. He was bold, resourceful, and physically formidable, and he was not minded to die in a London jail. And so he did the thing that ran through his whole character, the thing that marked him out from quieter men. He escaped, together with his priest and a servant. Owen broke out of Newgate, won free of the prison, and made his bid for liberty, a daring flight that astonished the authorities. To break out of a place like Newgate was no small feat, for such jails, though squalid, were built to hold men fast, with stout doors and heavy locks and keepers ever watchful for the bribe or the violence that might let a prisoner slip away. Owen and his two companions managed it somehow, by force or by cunning or by the corruption of a jailer, hurting the keeper in the process by some accounts, and getting clear of the prison walls into the streets of London and then away. It was the act of a desperate and a determined man, one who would not meekly accept the fate his enemies had marked out for him. And it tells us a great deal about the steel beneath his easy Welsh charm. Here was no passive victim awaiting rescue, but a fighter who, finding himself caged, set his whole will to breaking the cage. The flight did not win him lasting freedom, for the reach of the authorities was long, and he was hunted down and taken once more. But the escape itself stands as a mark of the man, the same boldness that had let him reach for a queen now driving him to break from a king's prison. The escape did not bring lasting freedom at once. He was hunted, pursued, and in time taken again, recaptured and returned to confinement. And for a while the cat and mouse continued, the Welshman slipping the net and being caught again, a fugitive in the realm whose queen he had married. It was a precarious and a frightening existence. This life of imprisonment and flight and recapture lived always under the shadow of his powerful enemies and the uncertainty of his fate. And yet there was something in Owen's resilience, his refusal to be broken, his sheer survival through these dangerous years, that speaks of the toughness of the man. The hardy Welshman of fallen fortune who had clawed his way up from nothing and would not now be easily destroyed. In the end, slowly, the storm began to pass. The fury over the secret marriage, fierce as it had been, could not burn forever, and Owen, who had committed no crime worse than loving and wedding the Queen, could not in the end be lawfully destroyed for it. Gradually, his position eased. He was granted a pardon, his offences set aside, and in time he was even restored to a measure of favour and provided for given lands or an income to support him, so that the hunted fugitive of the worst years became once more a man with a settled place, if a modest one, in the world. The long middle stretch of Owen's life, the years between the storms of his persecution and the storms of the wars, were the quietest he would know, and the most obscure to us. Restored to a measure of favour, provided with an income, no longer hunted, he settled into the life of a man of modest standing, under the protection of his royal stepson. He held some small offices, managed what lands and revenues had been granted him, and lived, one imagines, the ordinary life of a gentleman of the middle sort, neither great nor poor, watching from a comfortable distance as his sons rose toward greatness. These were the years in which Edmund and Jasper grew to manhood and were made earls, in which the family climbed from scandal to honour, and Owen, the father of it all, lived to see his children's elevation and to enjoy, in his later middle years, a security and a respect that the prisoner of Newgate could scarcely have hoped for. It was, by any reasonable measure, a happy turn, the long calm reward of a man who had survived the worst his enemies could do. He was no longer the dashing servant who had won a queen, but an ageing man of settled life, the honoured stepfather of the king and the father of earls. Had the realm stayed at peace, he might have died so quietly in his bed, full of years. But the realm did not stay at peace, and the quiet middle years were the calm before the last and bloodiest storm of his life. The change owed much, in the end, to the growing kindness of one particular person, the king himself. For King Henry VI, Catherine's son by her first husband, was growing toward manhood, and he was a gentle and a pious soul. Indeed, he was, in his own person, one of the gentlest and least worldly men ever to wear the English crown, more suited by temperament to the cloister than to the throne. He was devout to the point of saintliness, given to long hours of prayer, scrupulous in his religion, mild and merciful and forgiving by nature, shrinking from cruelty and bloodshed, dressing plainly, founding schools and colleges, caring far more for the things of God and of learning than for the hard business of ruling a turbulent kingdom. These were lovely qualities in a man, and disastrous ones in a medieval king, for the age demanded a hard and a forceful ruler, and Henry's gentleness would in time help to bring the realm to ruin. But that same gentleness, that same warmth of heart, was the salvation of Owen and his sons. Where a harder king might have seen in his mother's Welsh husband only a scandal to be crushed, the gentle Henry saw family, half-brothers to be loved, and a stepfather to be forgiven. He had lost his own father in infancy, and his mother while still a boy, and the discovery that he had half-brothers, kin of his own blood, seems to have touched something deep in his affectionate and lonely heart. And so the gentle soul on the throne became the protector of the very family that his mother's forbidden marriage had made, and lifted them in his kindness toward greatness. And he came to look with favour rather than with anger upon the Welsh stepfather and the half-brothers his mother's secret marriage had given him. Where the proud Duke of Gloucester had seen only scandal and affront, the gentle king saw family. And that royal kindness, as it deepened, would not only save Owen, but would lift his sons to heights that the prisoner of Newgate could scarcely have imagined in his darkest hours. While Owen had been suffering through his years of imprisonment and flight, his two young sons, Edmund and Jasper, had been placed in safekeeping, and their upbringing turned out to be the making of them. After Catherine's death, the boys, still small children, were given into the care of a noblewoman named Catherine de la Pole, the abbess of the great convent of Barking, a place of high standing where the daughters and the wards of the powerful were raised. There, in the ordered and comfortable world of a wealthy abbey, the two sons of the Queen and the Welsh servant were brought up, well educated, cared for, raised not as the hidden children of a scandal, but as young people of consequence, whose king's blood was quietly acknowledged. An abbey like Barking was far more than a house of prayer. It was a wealthy and a powerful institution. Its abbess, a woman of high rank and great consequence, who ruled over broad estates and a large community. And such houses commonly took in the children of the well-born, to be raised and schooled within their walls. For Edmund and Jasper, it was an upbringing both safe and fitting, a sheltered childhood in a place of order and learning, where they would have been taught their letters and their faith, their manners and their bearing, the accomplishments proper to boys of high blood. Behind the abbey walls, away from the dangers and the scandals of the wider world, the two sons of the secret marriage grew toward manhood, in security and comfort, watched over by the abbess, their needs provided for. Their royal half-blood, quietly understood by those around them. It was a far kinder fate than the children of so dangerous a secret might have met, and it reflected the truth that whatever the scandal of their birth, these boys could not simply be discarded, for they were the half-brothers of the king himself. The abbey gave them what their hunted father could not in those years, a stable and a dignified childhood, and it prepared them, though no one yet knew it, for the great destinies that waited. The boys who studied their lessons in the quiet of Barking would one day be Earls of England and the founders, between them, of a royal line. It was a far gentler fate than might have befallen the children of so dangerous a secret, and it reflected the fact that, whatever the scandal of their birth, Edmund and Jasper were the half-brothers of the king, and could not simply be cast aside. So while their father languished in Newgate and fled across the country, the boys grew up safe and well tended in the abbey at Barking, their futures uncertain, but their persons protected, waiting for the day when the king, their half-brother, would decide what was to be done with them. That day came as the young king grew to manhood and took the reins of his own affairs. For Henry VI, gentle and devout and family-minded, chose to embrace rather than to disown his Welsh half-brothers. It was a remarkable decision, and a generous one. The king might easily have left Edmund and Jasper in obscurity, an embarrassing reminder of his mother's scandalous second marriage. Instead, he acknowledged them openly as his own blood, his half-brothers by their shared mother, and took them into his care and his favour. He brought them to court, saw to their education and their advancement, and treated them as honoured members of the king's family. For the boys themselves, this royal embrace transformed everything. They passed, in the king's favour, from the obscure and ambiguous status of a scandal's children into the bright certainty of acknowledged royal kin. They were brought to the heart of the court, given the education and the training proper to young noblemen, taught to ride and to bear arms, to read and to reckon, to carry themselves among the great. They learned to know the king, their half-brother, who treated them with a warm and a brotherly affection, and they grew up in the expectation of the high place that their king's blood now promised them. It was a dizzying ascent for the sons of a Welsh servant who had been a prisoner in Newgate, from the quiet of the abbey at Barking to the splendour of the royal court, from the children of a hidden scandal to the favoured half-brothers of the king. And the boys, by every sign, repaid his kindness with a deep and lasting loyalty, a devotion to the House of Lancaster that would carry Jasper, in particular, through a lifetime of faithful service and sacrifice. The king, who had been so kind to his Welsh half-brothers, had bound them to his cause with ties of gratitude that nothing, not even the ruin of that cause, would ever break. For Owen, watching from his modest restored position, it must have been a wonder beyond words to see the sons he had fathered in secret, the children of a hunted and imprisoned Welshman, taken up by the King of England and raised to the dignity of royal kinsmen. The half-king's blood that had been such a danger in the years of the secret was now under a kindly king a passport to greatness. And the greatness, when it came, was very great indeed, for the king did not merely acknowledge his half-brothers. He raised them to the high nobility of the realm. Edmund the elder was created Earl of Richmond, and Jasper the younger was created Earl of Pembroke. And the two sons of the Welsh servant were thus lifted by the king's grace into the topmost ranks of the English aristocracy, made earls, endowed with lands and titles, and a place among the greatest men of the kingdom. Think of the distance travelled in a single generation. Their father had been born into a ruined Welsh family under the penal laws, a man barred by his race from the very towns and offices of his own country, who had risen only to be a servant in a great household. And now his sons were Earls of England, royal kinsmen, among the foremost noblemen of the realm. It was a transformation as steep and as astonishing as any in the history of the age, and it had all flowed from that secret, forbidden, dangerous marriage made in the shadows years before. The reckless love of the Queen and the servant, which had brought Owen to Newgate and nearly to his death, had also brought their sons to the heights of the English nobility. Owen Tudor, the hunted Welshman, was now the father of two earls. And then came the marriage that would matter more than any earldom, the quiet union from which a dynasty would spring. The king, seeking to bind his half-brother Edmund yet more closely to the royal blood, arranged for him a marriage of the highest importance. Edmund, Earl of Richmond, was wedded to a young heiress named Margaret Beaufort, a girl who for all her tender years held in her own veins the king's blood of the House of Lancaster, descended from a younger branch of the line of King Edward III. It was a marriage that joined Owen's Welsh and royal French descent, carried in his son Edmund, to the Lancastrian line of kings held in Margaret Beaufort. And the joining of those two streams would prove to be the source of the Tudor claim to the throne of England itself. Margaret Beaufort was a remarkable figure in her own right, though at the time of the marriage she was scarcely more than a child. A girl of formidable intelligence and iron will wrapped in a tiny and delicate frame. She descended from a younger branch of the royal house, the line that sprang from a son of King Edward III. And though that branch had once been barred from the succession, the bar had grown shaky and uncertain with the passing years, and her blood carried, however faintly, a claim to the crown. She was also an heiress, and her wardship and her marriage were prizes of high value, which is why the king bestowed her upon his half-brother Edmund. The marriage of the girl heiress and the king's Welsh-blooded half-brother was at the time simply a shrewd piece of royal policy, binding a wealthy claimant heiress to the inner royal family. But it would prove to be the hinge on which English history turned, for from the union of Edmund Tudor and Margaret Beaufort would come the boy who united in himself the Welsh blood of Owen, the French descent of Catherine, and the Lancastrian king's blood of the Beauforts, and who would carry all of it, in time, to the throne. Owen, by now an aging man, can have had no clear notion of what this marriage would one day mean, of the king who would spring from it and the dynasty that would follow. To him it was, very likely, simply the crowning triumph of his line, his son the Earl marrying a wealthy heiress, the family he had founded in secret rising higher than he could ever have dreamed. But from that marriage of Edmund and Margaret would come, in time, a son who would be King of England, and Owen Tudor, the servant who had married a queen, would prove to be the grandfather of a royal dynasty. So Owen Tudor came, in the autumn of his life, into a calmer and a more honoured place than he could have hoped for in the bitter days of Newgate. He was an old man now by the measure of his age, but he was the father of 2 earls, the stepfather of the king, a man received at court and provided for, his scandalous past softened by time and by the kindness of his royal stepson. It was a strange and a satisfying turn for a Welshman of fallen fortune, who had spent years as a hunted fugitive. He had outlived the fury of his enemies, outlived even the proud duke who had hounded him, and he had seen the children of his secret marriage lifted to the heights of the realm. The men of the Middle Ages had a favourite image for such reversals of fortune, the great wheel forever turning, lifting men toward the heights and casting them down again, and few lives illustrated that turning wheel more vividly than Owen's. He had been born near the bottom, a poor man of a conquered race under disabling laws. He had risen, by service and by daring, to the bed of a queen, only to be cast down again into a prison cell and the life of a hunted fugitive when his royal wife died. And now the wheel had carried him up once more, into honour and security and the reflected glory of his risen sons. An old man restored to dignity after all his trials. He had ridden that wheel through more turns than most men ever know, from obscurity to the summit to the depths, and back toward the heights again. And through all of it, he had kept his nerve and his life and his spirit. It would have been a fitting place for his story to end, an old man at peace in the evening of an extraordinary life, his trials behind him and his sons risen high. But the wheel was not done turning, and it had one more terrible descent in store for him, in the wars that were even then gathering over the realm. He could look back on a life that had took him further than any servant had any right to expect. From a ruined house in Anglesey to the bed of a queen to the company of kings, and he might reasonably have expected, now, to live out his remaining years in peace, an honoured old man, basking in the glory of his risen sons. But the times would not allow it, for even as Owen aged into his hard-won security, the kingdom around him was sliding toward a catastrophe that would sweep up his whole family and carry him, at the very end, to a bloody death he could never have foreseen. The catastrophe was the long and terrible quarrel that we remember as the Wars of the Roses, the savage civil conflict between 2 branches of the royal family, the House of Lancaster and the House of York, for the crown of England. The gentle King Henry VI, Owen's stepson, who had been so kind to him and his sons, proved a disastrous ruler, weak and unworldly and subject to spells of madness, and under his feeble hand the realm slid into faction and disorder. There is a deep sadness in the fate of this gentle king, the man whose kindness had raised Owen's family from scandal to greatness. The very qualities that made him so good a man, his mildness, his mercy, his unworldly piety, made him a calamity as a king, for the throne of medieval England demanded a hard and a forceful ruler, and Henry could not be hard. He let the government fall into the hands of grasping favourites, allowed the powerful lords to feud unchecked, and at the times when his wits deserted him altogether, he was incapable of ruling at all, a holy and helpless figure at the centre of a kingdom tearing itself apart. He would lose his throne, regain it, and lose it again in the savage turns of the wars, would see his only son killed and his cause destroyed, and would die at last a prisoner in the Tower of London, murdered, it was widely believed, on the orders of his triumphant enemies. It was a piteous end for the gentle soul who had been so kind to his Welsh kin, and Owen did not live to see it, dying himself some years before his stepson's final fall. But the ruin of Henry's cause was the ruin that swept up Owen too, for it was in fighting for that failing king against the rising power of York that the old Welshman met his death. A powerful rival, the Duke of York, pressed his own claim to the throne, and the kingdom split into armed camps, Lancastrian against Yorkist, and tumbled into a war of battles and beheadings, of shifting fortunes and murdered lords. That would tear England apart for a generation. These wars were a peculiarly bitter kind of conflict, a war within the ruling class itself, fought not between nations but between two branches of a single royal family and the leading lords who took their sides. The fighting was done by the private armies of the nobility, bands of retainers who wore their lord's badge and livery, and followed him to war, bound to him by pay and loyalty and the hope of reward. So that the realm was carved into rival affinities, networks of armed men gathered around the great magnates, and the wars were marked by a growing savagery as they wore on. In the early clashes, some of the old chivalric restraint survived, with defeated lords spared and ransomed. But as the quarrel deepened and the bitterness grew, that restraint fell away and the wars became merciless, with no quarter given to the leaders of the beaten side. After a lost battle, the captured lords and knights of the defeated party were commonly put to death, beheaded without trial, their heads set on spikes above the city gates, so that each round of fighting thinned the ranks of the nobility and sowed fresh seeds of vengeance. It was into this pitiless world of private armies and battlefield executions that Owen and his sons were drawn, fighting for the Lancastrian cause of their kinsman the king, and it was this savagery, this custom of beheading the captured leaders of the losing side, that would in the end bring the old Welshman to the block at Hereford, and in this great quarrel, Owen and his sons could be in no doubt where they stood. Loyalty, in that age, was reckoned among the highest of virtues, the very glue that held the fragile order of society together, and to betray one's lord or one's kin was counted among the blackest of sins. They were the kin of the Lancastrian king. Henry VI was Owen's stepson and the half-brother of his sons, the source of all their greatness, the man who had raised them from scandal to earldoms. Every consideration of honour and gratitude and blood bound the Tudors to the Lancastrian cause, and Owen, whatever else he was a man of deep loyalty, faithful to the queen he had loved, faithful to the king who had been kind to him, faithful to the house that had lifted his family from the ruin of scandal. In a turbulent age when many a lord changed sides as the fortunes of war shifted, seeking always the winning party, Owen and his sons held to their cause through defeat and disaster, never wavering, never seeking terms with the enemy, even when their loyalty seemed certain to destroy them. There was something old-fashioned and noble in that constancy, a refusal to abandon a losing side for the sake of safety, that belonged to the best traditions of the age of chivalry. It cost Owen his head and Jasper his country, and it would have seemed, for years, like ruinous folly. But it was the saving of the family in the end, for it was that very loyalty, unbroken through every disaster, that kept the Lancastrian claim alive in Tudor hands until the day it could triumph. Loyalty, gratitude, and self-interest all pointed the same way. Owen Tudor and his sons were Lancastrians to the bone, bound to the cause of the king who was their kinsman and their benefactor, and as the wars deepened, they threw themselves into his cause, fighting for the House of Lancaster in the brutal struggle for the crown. In the midst of these gathering troubles, a private grief and a momentous birth fell together upon Owen's family. His elder son Edmund, the Earl of Richmond, the husband of Margaret Beaufort, died young, carried off by sickness while still a man in his 20s, leaving his girl wife a widow before she had reached her 14th year and with child besides. Edmund's death came in the dangerous opening of the wars, and there was a hard edge to it, for he had been captured by enemies in the fighting in Wales and held prisoner, and it was in captivity, or soon after, that he fell sick and died, very likely of one of the pestilences that swept through the close and filthy conditions of confinement. He was a man of promise, the elder of Owen's 2 risen sons, the husband of a wealthy heiress, and his early death was a heavy blow to the family's fortunes and to his father's heart. He left behind him a child widow and an unborn son, and the whole weight of carrying forward the family's hopes passed at his death to his brother Jasper and to the infant yet to be born. It is one of the sharp ironies of the story that Edmund, the son through whom the line of kings would actually descend, never lived to see his own child, never knew that the son his young widow carried would one day be King of England. He died a young earl in the early skirmishing of the wars, and his glory was entirely posthumous, living on in the son he never saw, and the dynasty he never knew he had founded. For Owen, the loss of his elder son was a grief, but it was a grief that carried, hidden within it, the seed of the greatest triumph of his line. It was a heavy blow, the loss of the elder of Owen's 2 risen sons, cut down in his youth in the dangerous opening years of the wars. But out of that loss came the most important birth in the whole history of Owen's line. For the widowed Margaret, scarcely more than a child herself, gave birth to Edmund's son, a boy named Henry, born in a castle in Wales in the depths of winter. The circumstances of that birth were perilous and bleak. Margaret was a girl of 13, widowed and heavily with child, sheltering in a Welsh castle in the cold of midwinter, while the wars raged across the land. The birth was hard and dangerous. So much so that it was a wonder both mother and child survived it, for a girl so slight, bearing a first child in such circumstances, stood in real danger of her life. But survive they both did, the child Henry coming into the world in that winter fortress, and the bond forged between the girl mother and her only son in that dangerous hour would prove to be one of the strongest forces in English history. For Margaret would devote the whole of her formidable will, for the rest of her long life, to the cause of her son. The boy born in that cold Welsh castle, the fatherless son of a girl of 13, the grandson of a beheaded Welsh servant, was as unlikely a candidate for the throne of England as could be imagined. And yet the blood of 3 royal lines met in him, and the love and the will of a mother and an uncle would carry him, against every probability, to a crown. The winter birth in the Welsh castle was the quiet beginning of the House of Tudor's rise to the throne. This child, Henry Tudor, was the grandson of Owen and of Catherine, the great-grandson of the King of France, and through his mother, the carrier of the Lancastrian king's blood. He was, though no one could have guessed it as he lay in his cradle in war-torn Wales, the future King of England, the founder of the Tudor dynasty in his own person. Owen, the old Welshman, was now a grandfather, and the grandchild born in that winter castle would one day wear the crown of England. But all of that lay far ahead, hidden in an unknowable future. And for the present, the infant Henry was simply a fatherless baby in a dangerous land, the heir of a defeated cause whose very survival was in doubt. The protection of that fragile family now fell largely upon Owen's surviving son, Jasper, the Earl of Pembroke, who emerges in these years as one of the most steadfast and loyal figures of the whole sad story. Jasper Tudor was a soldier and a man of unshakable constancy, and he took upon himself the care of his dead brother's widow and infant son, sheltering the child Henry in his Welsh strongholds. And at the same time he carried on the family's fight for the Lancastrian cause with a dogged determination that nothing could break. Father and son, Owen and Jasper, stood together for Lancaster as the wars raged, 2 generations of Tudors in arms for the king who was their kinsman. There is something moving in the picture of them, the old man and his soldier son, fighting side by side for a cause that bound them by every tie of blood and gratitude. Owen had risen from nothing by his own daring, had founded the family's rise by his forbidden marriage, and now in his old age he stood in the line of battle beside the son that marriage had given him, the two of them defending the house that had raised them from scandal to greatness. They had every reason for their loyalty, and more than reason. The king was Owen's stepson and Jasper's half-brother, the source of all their honour, the gentle soul who had embraced them when he might have cast them aside. To abandon his cause would have been the blackest ingratitude, and neither Owen nor Jasper was capable of it. So they held to Lancaster through the darkening fortunes of the war, the old founder and the steadfast son, and when the cause demanded it, they took up arms and marched to its defence. It was a loyalty that would cost Owen his life, and Jasper his lands and his country, years of exile and danger. But it was a loyalty unto death, and it was, in the end, the saving of the family, for it was Jasper's unbreakable faith that bore the boy Henry through the long years to the throne. It was a hard and a perilous calling, for the fortunes of the Lancastrian cause were sinking, and to fight for a losing side in those merciless wars was to risk everything. But Owen and Jasper did not waver. They were bound to the house of Lancaster by every tie of blood and gratitude, and they would follow that cause through defeat and disaster, the old Welshman and his soldier son holding to their loyalty as the storm closed in around them. And the storm, when it broke fully upon Owen, would carry him to the end of his long and extraordinary life. By the opening weeks of the year 1461, the war had turned grim indeed for the House of Lancaster, and for the Tudors who served it. The Duke of York, who had claimed the throne, was dead, killed in battle, but his cause had passed to his son, a tall and brilliant man named Edward, the new Duke of York, who proved to be one of the finest soldiers of the age. He was a striking figure, this young duke, exceptionally tall for his time, well over 6 feet, handsome and golden-haired, and full of an easy charm that drew men to him. And beneath the charm lay a hard and a capable soldier with a gift for swift and decisive action. He had lost his father and a brother to the wars, killed and beheaded by the Lancastrians, and he came to the fight with a young man's energy and a son's desire for vengeance, determined to make good his family's claim to the crown. In the months that followed his father's death, he would move with astonishing speed and boldness, winning battles, seizing the initiative, and within a few short months of Mortimer's Cross, he would have himself proclaimed king, the first sovereign of the House of York. He was, in short, exactly the kind of hard, young, energetic leader that the cause of York needed and that the failing House of Lancaster so desperately lacked. And his rise spelled doom for the Lancastrian cause and for the old men, like Owen, who served it. It was Owen's misfortune to come up against this brilliant soldier at the very beginning of his meteoric rise, to be among the first victims of a man who would sweep all before him, and to fall, an old man, on a losing side, before the energy of a rising star. The wars had entered a savage and a decisive phase, with great armies marching across England and battles fought with merciless ferocity, no quarter given to the defeated. Lords and commoners alike cut down or dragged to the block. Owen, old as he was, took the field once more for Lancaster, raising men in Wales together with his son Jasper, gathering a force to fight for the king's cause in the west. The campaign that brought him to his last battle was part of a larger and a desperate moment in the wars. The Lancastrian cause had suffered a grievous blow, but it was also gathering its strength for a counterstroke, and armies were on the move across the kingdom. Owen and Jasper, in Wales and the border country, raised what men they could from the Tudor lands and the Lancastrian loyalists of the region, mustering a force to join the wider Lancastrian effort. They marched eastward toward the Marches, the wild border country between Wales and England, a land of hills and river valleys that had seen war for centuries. And there, near the little place called Mortimer's Cross, in the cold heart of winter, they came up against the army of the Duke of York, Edward, the dead Duke's son and heir, who was proving himself one of the most dangerous soldiers of the age, swift and decisive and bold. Edward was young, not yet 20, but he had the gift of command and the favour of fortune, and he was hungry to avenge his father's death and to press his family's claim to the crown. The stage was set in that frozen border country for a battle that would shatter the Lancastrian force and carry Owen Tudor to his death. He was an old man now, well past 60, an age at which most men of his time had long since left the dangers of war behind. But Owen Tudor had been a fighter and a survivor all his life, and he would not sit idle while his family's cause hung in the balance. To take the field at his age was no small thing, for medieval war was a brutal business of hard marching and harder fighting, of cold camps and scant food, and the press of armoured men in the chaos of battle, and it was a man's trade. An old man who rode to war did so, knowing that his years gave him no mercy on the field, that the blade did not spare the grey-haired, that capture or death waited as readily for him as for the youngest soldier in the line. Yet Owen went, raising his men and marching to the muster, an old Welshman taking up arms once more for the cause of his blood. There was something in him of the old warrior who cannot rest while the fight goes on, who would rather face the dangers of the field than sit safe at home while his family's fate is decided. And there was loyalty in it too, the unbreakable bond that tied him to the house of his stepson and his sons. He had spent his youth seeking his fortune in the wars of France, and now, in his old age, he would spend his last strength in the wars of England, fighting for the dynasty his own love had founded. It was a fitting thing, in its way, that the old man who had dared so much for love should end his life in arms, faithful to the last, to the cause of his blood. And so, in the cold of that winter, the old Welshman led his men out to war, marching to meet the army of the Duke of York in the border country between Wales and England, near a place called Mortimer's Cross. The battle was joined on a freezing February morning, and it was marked by a strange and memorable omen that men long remembered. As the armies prepared to fight, there appeared in the cold winter sky a remarkable sight. 3 suns shining together in the heavens, a rare trick of the light through the ice clouds that made it seem as though 3 suns hung side by side above the field. To the soldiers of that superstitious age, such a portent was full of meaning, and the young Duke of York, quick-witted as ever, seized upon it, declaring to his men that the 3 suns were a sign of God's favour, a token of the Holy Trinity shining upon their cause. And he turned the strange omen into a banner of courage for his army. The phenomenon his soldiers saw that morning was what we now understand to be a trick of ice crystals high in the cold air, a rare effect that can make 2 false images of the sun appear on either side of the true one, so that 3 suns seem to hang together in the sky. To the men of that age, who knew nothing of such optics and read the heavens for signs of God's will, It was a portent of the gravest meaning, and a lesser commander might have let it unnerve his troops, who could as easily have read 3 sons as an omen of doom. But the Duke of York had the quick wit and the iron nerve of a born leader. Seeing his men waver at the strange sight, he cried out to them that the 3 sons were no evil omen, but a blessing, a sign of the Holy Trinity, Father and Son and Spirit, shining down in favour upon their cause. And he bade them take heart and fight under the sign of God's own favour. It was a masterstroke of leadership, turning fear into courage in a single moment, and the Duke was so taken with the omen that he afterwards adopted the sun as his personal badge, the blazing sun that he would carry for the rest of his life. For Owen and the Lancastrians, that same sky held no such comfort, and the day that dawned under the 3 suns would be the day of their ruin. It is worth pausing on how differently the people of Owen's age saw the world from the way we see it. For they lived in a universe thick with signs and meanings. To them, the heavens were not empty space, but a book written by God, in which comets and eclipses and strange lights foretold the fates of kingdoms and the deaths of princes. They read omens in the flight of birds and the entrails of beasts, in dreams and in chance words, in the markings of the sky. Prophecy was taken with deadly seriousness. The old verses of seers pored over for hints of what was to come, and a man might shape his actions by a prediction made centuries before. This was the mental world Owen inhabited, a time in which the 3 suns over Mortimer's cross were not a curious trick of ice and light, but a message from heaven, in which the ancient Welsh prophecy of a deliverer was a living force that men believed and acted upon. We should not be too quick to smile at it, for it gave their lives a shape and a meaning that ours often lack. A sense that the events of the world were woven into a great design, that nothing was wholly random, that the turning of fortune's wheel and the rise and fall of men were watched over and foretold. Owen lived and died inside that enchanted universe, and the strange afterlife of his blood, the fulfillment of an old prophecy by his own grandson, would have seemed to the people of his age not a coincidence, but exactly the kind of pattern the universe was made to show. Whatever the truth of the sign, the day belonged to York. In the battle that followed, the Lancastrian force led by Owen and Jasper was broken and routed, scattered by the soldiers of the young Duke, and the Tudor cause suffered a crushing defeat. Jasper, the soldier son, managed to escape the wreck of the battle and flee to safety, to fight another day and to guard the precious child Henry. His escape, while his father was taken, was the difference between the survival of the Tudor cause and its extinction, for had both father and son fallen at Mortimer's cross, there would have been no one to carry the family's hopes forward, no protector for the infant Henry, and the line might have ended there in the rout of a single battle. But Jasper got clear, slipping away from the disaster to live and fight, and above all, to guard. It must have been a bitter flight for him, leaving the field where his father was lost, not knowing at first whether Owen lived or died, carrying with him only the duty to survive and to protect what remained, and protect it he did. Across the long years of defeat that followed, Jasper would be the shield of the Tudor cause, the guardian of the boy, in whom all its hopes were vested, never abandoning the fight, never giving up the child to his enemies, carrying him at last into the safety of exile. The escape from Mortimer's cross was the first link in that long chain of survival, the moment when the soldier's son slipped the net that had caught his father and lived to carry the family's future to safety. Owen died, but his cause did not die with him, because Jasper lived to carry it on. But the old man was not so fortunate. In the rout that followed the battle, the aged Welshman was taken prisoner by the victorious Yorkists, captured upon the field where his cause had fallen. The prisoners taken at Mortimer's cross could expect no mercy, for the wars had grown pitiless, and it was the custom of the victors to put the captured leaders of the defeated side to death. Owen was carried to the nearby town of Hereford, and there it was determined that he should be executed, beheaded in the marketplace as a traitor to the House of York. Execution in that age was a public act, carried out before the gathered townsfolk, for it was meant not only to end a life, but to teach a lesson, to display the power of the victors and the fate of those who opposed them. The condemned man would be brought out before the crowd, and a block of wood set up in the open square, and the headsman would stand ready with his axe. For a man of rank, beheading was the customary death, accounted more honourable than the hanging reserved for common felons. And so Owen, as a man of standing and the father of earls, was to die by the axe. The crowd that gathered in the Hereford marketplace that day would have been a mixed throng, some drawn by the grim spectacle, some by sympathy, some by mere curiosity. Townsfolk and soldiers and country people pressing in to witness the death of the old Welshman who had married a queen. It was a brutal piece of theatre, the public killing of a defeated enemy, and it was the common fate of the losing side in those merciless wars. Owen had seen such deaths before, no doubt, in the course of the fighting. Now it was his turn to climb to the block, an old man in a cold square, with the winter crowd looking on. We may let our minds rest a moment on that scene, for it is the place where his long journey ended. Hereford was a town of the Welsh marches, that border country between England and Wales that Owen knew well, and on that February day it would have lain under the grey cold of midwinter, the market square ringed with timbered houses, the breath of the gathered crowd hanging in the frozen air. Soldiers of the victorious army kept the ground, and the townsfolk pressed in to see the spectacle. The killing of the old Welsh lord who had been the Queen's husband. There would have been the rough scaffold or the simple block set up in the open, the headsman waiting, and Owen brought out from his confinement to die. It was a far cry from the gilded chambers where he had once moved as the secret husband of a queen, this cold provincial square with its winter crowd and its waiting axe. And yet there was a kind of fitness in it too, that the marches he had crossed, as a man seeking his fortune, should be the place where his journey ended, that the borderland between his conquered homeland and the kingdom that had conquered it should hold his death. The Welshman who had ventured into England to make his fortune came, at the last, back to the border country, to die in a market square within sight, almost, of the hills of home. And here we come to one of the most striking moments in Owen's whole story, a moment that reveals the man at the very end of his long life. For by the accounts that have come down to us, Owen did not at first believe that he would really be put to death. Perhaps he trusted in his age, or in some half-promise, or simply could not credit that, after all he had survived, his life would end on a block in a country town. He seems to have held some hope of rescue or reprieve, almost until the final moment, and it was only when his collar was torn open in readiness for the axe that the truth of his situation broke fully upon him. That this was indeed the end, that the old Welshman who had married a queen and fathered earls was about to die under the headsman's blade in a Hereford street. There is something deeply human in that instant of disbelief, and it tells us much about the man. Owen had survived so much, the ruin of his family, the dangers of the wars in France, the fury of Gloucester, the prison of Newgate, the years as a hunted fugitive. He had ridden the wheel of fortune up and down so many times and always come through. Perhaps, after a lifetime of narrow escapes and unlikely survivals, he simply could not believe that this time there would be no reprieve, that the luck and the resilience that had carried him so far had finally run out. Perhaps he clung, to the very last, to the hope of a rescue, a pardon, a change of heart among his captors. Old men who have survived much often find it hardest of all to believe in their own deaths. And so he came to the block, one imagines, still half expecting to be spared. until the rough hands at his collar, baring his neck for the blade, made the truth undeniable. And it was in that instant, when disbelief gave way at last to certainty, that his mind reached back across all the years to the one love of his life, and he spoke the words that would outlive him. And in that final moment finding his death upon him, Owen Tudor spoke words that have echoed down the centuries, words that gathered up the whole strange wonder of his life into a single sentence. Looking, it is said, at the block before him, he spoke of the queen he had loved so long ago, saying that the head, which was about to fall, would lie now upon the same block, the same stock of wood, that had once been wont to lie in Queen Catherine's lap. It was a strange and a moving avowal to make at such a moment, the old man's mind going back, at the very edge of death, across all the years to the queen he had loved in secret, to the tenderness of those hidden days. The memory of her lap rising up before him as the axe waited. In that one sentence, the whole arc of his life stood revealed. The servant who had loved a queen, the hidden marriage, the long dangerous years, all of it gathered into the dying words of an old man kneeling in a marketplace. And then the sentence was carried out. Owen Tudor, the Welshman of fallen fortune who had risen so impossibly high, was beheaded in the marketplace at Hereford. His long and astonishing life brought to its end under the blade. But even in death, his story was not quite finished, for what happened to his severed head in that Hereford square is one of the strangest and most tender things in all his tale. After the axe had fallen, the severed head of Owen Tudor was set upon the market cross of Hereford, displayed there as the head of an executed traitor in the grim custom of the age. And there, in that public place, an extraordinary and a tender thing occurred. A woman of the town, described in the old chronicle as poor and perhaps not quite right in her wits, came to the head of the dead Welshman and tended it with a strange and touching care. She washed the blood from the old man's face, and she combed his grey hair, and she set about his head a ring of burning candles, more than 100 of them by the telling, so that the head of Owen Tudor sat upon the market cross of Hereford encircled by a soft crown of candlelight. It is one of the most haunting images in the whole of this long story, the severed head of the Queen's secret husband, washed and combed and ringed with candle flame by a poor madwoman in a market square. A last act of tenderness toward a man whose life had been so full of love and daring and loss. There is something almost unbearably poignant in the image, and it has haunted everyone who has ever told this story. Here was a man who had loved a queen, who had founded a line of kings, who had lived a life of extraordinary romance and ambition, and at the end, his severed head sat upon a market cross, and the only tenderness shown to it came from a poor woman of disordered mind, a nobody who washed away the blood and combed the grey hair and set the little flames burning all around. Perhaps she did it out of some half-grasped sense that this had been a great man, fallen low. Perhaps she did it out of simple human pity for a dead old man treated like refuse. Perhaps in her broken mind, she saw something the sane crowd could not. We will never know, but the gesture has outlived the names of the powerful men who ordered Owen's death, and it has become the way his story is remembered. The candles burning in the dusk around the head of the Queen's husband. It is as if, at the very end, when all his greatness had been stripped away and he was reduced to a traitor's head on a pole, one last soul recognized that here was something worthy of reverence and gave him, in place of the honors of the world, a quiet crown of candlelight, and there is a deeper fitness in it than the poor woman could have known. For Owen's whole life had been lived in the gap between his outward station and his inward worth. A man the world counted as nothing who proved himself worthy of a queen's love and became the father of kings. The world had always seen the servant, the Welshman, the nobody, and missed the man. And now, at the very end, the time saw only a traitor's head, an object of horror set up as a warning. Yet one soul, looking at that head, saw past the horror to something worthy of tenderness and honour, and crowned it with light. It was the truth of his life made visible in a single strange image, the worth that the age had never recognised acknowledged at last, in the place of public shame, by the humblest of hands. The mighty had given him the axe. A madwoman gave him a crown of candles. And it is her gift, not theirs, that we remember. The small flames burning in the winter dusk around the head of the man who had loved a queen and would be the grandfather of a line of kings. There is one last quiet poignancy to mark, in the matter of where the two lovers came to rest. Catherine, the Queen, was laid among the kings and queens of England in the wealthy Abbey of Westminster, in the very heart of the realm, honoured in death with all the dignity of her royal blood. Owen the servant was buried, so far as we know, quietly and without grandeur near the place of his death in Hereford, his grave unmarked and in time forgotten, lost like so much else about him. So the two who had loved across the widest gulf of rank were divided in death as the world had tried to divide them in life. The Queen among the monuments of kings, the servant in an obscure grave in a border town, the one remembered in stone, the other vanished into the earth. And yet the division was, in the deepest sense, an illusion, for they were joined forever in a way no tomb could express, joined in the blood that ran down from them both through their children and their children's children, joined in the dynasty that sprang from their love and carried the two of them, the Queen and the servant, together into the line of England's kings. They lie apart, but they conquered together, and every Tudor who ever wore the crown held in his veins the mingled blood of the French princess and the Welsh servant, the living proof that what they had joined in secret no power on earth had been able to put asunder. We do not know who she was or why she did it, whether out of pity or reverence, or some private madness of her own. But across the centuries that small act of care still moves the heart, the candles burning around the old man's head in the cold. Hereford dusk, a strange and gentle benediction at the end of an astonishing life. So Owen Tudor died, an old man, on a winter's day in a border town, beheaded for a losing cause. By the ordinary reckoning of the world, it was a defeat, a sad and bloody end to a life that had risen high and fallen at the last upon the wrong side of a merciless war. And yet, in the deepest sense, Owen's life was not a defeat at all, but one of the most quietly triumphant in all of English history, for the chain he had set in motion in the shadows long before could not be killed upon any scaffold. His blood lived on. Far away, his son Jasper had escaped the ruin of Mortimer's cross, and with him, hidden and guarded, was the precious child, Owen's grandson, the boy Henry Tudor, in whom the whole future of the line was carried. When you consider how nearly that line was extinguished, again and again, the survival of it seems almost miraculous. Edmund, the father, had died young, leaving only an unborn child. That child had been born of a girl of 13 in a hard winter labour that might easily have killed them both. Owen himself had been taken and beheaded. Jasper had escaped by the narrowest of margins from the same battle. And in the long years of exile that followed, the boy Henry was hunted by the power of England, the subject of repeated plots and demands to give him up, surviving more than once only by luck and by a hair's breadth. At any one of a dozen points, the whole future might have been snuffed out. The child killed or captured, the line ended, the dynasty never born. That it survived at all, that the fragile thread of Owen's blood was not severed in the dangerous decades after his death, owed everything to fortune and to the unbreakable devotion of Jasper, who guarded the flame through every peril. It is a sobering thing to think how close the House of Tudor came, over and over, to never existing at all. and how much the whole later history of England hung, in those years, on the survival of one hunted boy and the faithfulness of one loyal man. The axe at Hereford had taken the old man, but it had not touched the seed he had planted, and that seed was even now being carried by the faithful Jasper into safety and into the unknowable future. The House of Lancaster might fall. The Tudors might be hunted and defeated. The old man might die in a marketplace. But somewhere in Wales a boy was growing who carried in his veins the blood of the servant and the queen. And the daring marriage made in the shadows had set in motion a thing that no battle and no headsman could undo. The years that followed Owen's death were dark ones for his line, a long night of defeat and exile. The House of York triumphed, the Duke of York becoming King Edward IV, and the Lancastrian cause was crushed and scattered, its leaders dead or fled. Jasper Tudor, Owen's loyal son, became a hunted fugitive, his lands and titles stripped away, forced to flee abroad. And he took with him, in time, the young boy Henry, carrying his fatherless nephew across the sea into exile in the Duchy of Brittany, there to wait out the long years of Yorkist rule. The exile in Brittany was a strange and a precarious limbo that stretched on for the better part of 14 years, the whole of the boy Henry's growing up. Brittany was then an independent duchy, neither English nor French, ruled by its own duke, and there the two Tudors, the loyal uncle and the fatherless boy, lived as honoured but anxious guests. Valued by the Duke as useful pieces in the great game of European politics, yet never truly safe. For the King of England wanted the boy, this last Lancastrian claimant, in his hands. And across the years there were repeated attempts, by money and by diplomacy and by something close to force, to have Henry handed over. Attempts that more than once came perilously close to success, and from which the boy escaped only by luck and by his uncle's vigilance. Jasper guarded his nephew through all of it, with the same unwavering loyalty he had shown to the Lancastrian cause from the beginning. The steadfast son of Owen Tudor, giving his whole life to the protection of his brother's child and the keeping of the family's claim. Year after year they waited in their Breton exile, the boy growing toward manhood, the cause they carried seeming ever more hopeless as the House of York entrenched itself upon the throne. It must have looked, for most of those long years, like a lost cause guarded by a stubborn man. And then, against all the odds, the wheel turned once more. For more than a decade, the last hope of the Tudor line lived as an exile in a foreign land, a penniless young pretender, guarded by his faithful uncle Jasper, the two of them keeping alive against all the odds. The claim that had come down to them through Owen's blood. It was a forlorn and a desperate hope through most of those years, the exiled boy and the loyal uncle, watching from across the water as the House of York held the throne of England. And yet Jasper never gave up, never abandoned his nephew or the cause, guarding the boy through every danger, keeping the flame alive. The steadfast son of Owen Tudor, carrying his father's blood and his father's loyalty through the long darkness toward a dawn that must have seemed, for years, as though it would never come. Of all the figures in this story, Jasper Tudor deserves to be remembered with particular honour, for his was a loyalty that nothing could break across a lifetime of defeat. He was not a brilliant man, by the accounts that survive, not a great general or a subtle statesman, but he possessed something rarer and more valuable than brilliance, an unshakable constancy of heart. Through victory and crushing defeat, through exile and poverty and danger, through years when his cause seemed utterly lost, and any sensible man would have made his peace with the victors, Jasper held to his loyalty without wavering, to the House of Lancaster, to the memory of his father and brother, and above all to the fatherless boy who was his nephew and his charge. He gave the whole of his life to that boy, sheltering him, guarding him, teaching him, carrying him into exile and keeping him safe through every peril, and at the last bringing him home to win a crown. Without Jasper, there would have been no Henry VII and no Tudor dynasty, for the boy would never have survived the long Yorkist years to claim his throne. The steadfastness that Jasper showed was in its quiet way as great a thing as any deed of arms, and it was the truest inheritance that Owen, the loyal old soldier who died for his cause, passed on to his son. But it came. In the year 1485, after long years of exile, Henry Tudor judged that his moment had arrived. The Yorkist king now was Richard III, whose seizure of the throne had divided and weakened his own party, and discontent with his rule had grown. Henry, the exile, gathered what support he could and sailed at last for the land of his birth, landing in Wales, the country of his grandfather Owen, where the memory of the Welsh blood of the Tudors helped to rally men to his banner. This was the moment the old prophecy came alive. Henry landed on the Welsh coast and marched through the land of his fathers, and as he went he raised the banner of the Red Dragon, the ancient emblem of the old British kings, the very symbol of Welsh hope and Welsh deliverance. To the Welsh, this was no foreign invader, but the promised one come at last, a man of their own blood, descended from the line of Penmynyd and the princes of Gwynedd through his grandfather Owen, marching under the dragon to claim a throne. The bards who had sung for centuries of the Mab Darogan, the son of prophecy who would restore the glory of the Britons, saw in Henry Tudor the fulfillment of their ancient song, and the Welsh rallied to him, swelling his army as he marched, lending the strength of a hopeful nation to the cause of the exile. The grandson of the Welsh servant came home to Wales as a deliverer, and Wales rose to follow him. It was a thing the bards had promised, and few had truly believed, and it was happening, the old dream walking the roads of Wales behind a red dragon banner. Carried by the blood of a man who had been beheaded in a marketplace 24 years before, he marched into England, gathering strength as he went, and met King Richard in battle at a field called Bosworth, in the heart of the kingdom. There, against the odds, the impossible prize came to pass. Richard was killed, his army broken, and the crown of England, so the old story goes, was found upon the field and set upon the head of Henry Tudor. The exile was a king, Henry VII, first sovereign of the House of Tudor, took the throne of England, and the long wars of York and Lancaster were brought toward their close. Bosworth was more than the victory of one claimant over another, for it marked, as men would later see, the closing of an age. The long medieval centuries of England, with their feudal lords and their private armies, their dynastic wars and their turning wheels of fortune, were drawing to an end, and a new and a different age was being born. The Tudors would rule a more settled and a more centralized realm, taming the great lords whose private armies had torn the kingdom apart, building a stronger crown and a more ordered state, presiding over the great changes that would carry England out of the Middle Ages and into the modern world. Bosworth, where Owen's grandson won his crown, is often taken as the very dividing line between the medieval and the modern in English history, the last act of the old age and the first of the new. It is a remarkable thing that this hinge of history, this turning point between two great epochs, should have been reached by the blood of a Welsh servant, that the man who closed the medieval age and opened the modern should have been the grandson of Owen Tudor. The poor Welshman's daring, his forbidden love made in the shadows, reached forward across the generations to help close one age of the time and open another. For the new king did a wise and a healing thing. To end the long quarrel that had torn the realm apart for 30 years, Henry married Elizabeth of York, the daughter of the Yorkist king Edward IV, joining in his own marriage the two warring houses, the Red Rose of Lancaster and the White Rose of York, that had bled the kingdom for a generation. From that union came a new emblem, the Tudor rose, red and white together, the symbol of a realm reconciled and a quarrel laid to rest. It was a stroke of symbolic genius that rose, for it took the badges of the two warring houses, the red rose said to stand for Lancaster, and the white rose of York, and fused them into a single flower, red and white together, proclaiming in one simple image that the long quarrel was over and the houses joined. The Tudor rose would bloom thereafter on the walls and the gates and the banners of the new dynasty, a constant reminder that the realm was healed, that the bleeding wound of the civil wars had been bound up by the marriage of the rival lines. And there was a deep truth in the symbol, for the new dynasty did indeed unite in itself the claims and the blood of both houses, the Lancastrian descent through Henry's mother and the Yorkist descent through his wife, so that no rival could easily claim a better right. The rose that healed the wars was the rose of Owen's line, the flower of the dynasty his forbidden marriage had founded. From a secret love in a queen's household had come, by the strangest of roads, the rose that reconciled a kingdom, and the red and white flower that bloomed over the peace of England carried at its root the blood of a Welsh servant and a French queen. The bitter wars that had carried Owen to the block at Hereford were ended, not by the triumph of one house over the other, but by their joining. And the dynasty that brought that peace was the dynasty of Owen's blood. It is worth pausing on the wonder of it. The savage wars in which Owen had died, fighting and losing for Lancaster, were brought to their close by Owen's own grandson, who united the rival houses and founded a lasting peace. The old man's death in the marketplace had seemed, at the time, the final ruin of his cause. Yet within a single generation, that cause had triumphed beyond anything he could have dreamed, and his blood sat upon a reconciled throne, healing the very wounds that had killed him. And the new King of England was the grandson of Owen Tudor, the Welsh servant who had died beneath the axe at Hereford 24 years before. Consider, for a moment, what that meant. Traced back along the line of blood, the new king who now wore the crown of England was the son of Edmund Tudor and Margaret Beaufort. Edmund had been the son of Owen Tudor and Catherine of Valois, and so the crown of England now rested upon the head of the grandson of a French princess and a Welsh servant, the direct descendant of that secret, forbidden, unthinkable marriage made in the shadows half a century before. Every law that had been raised against that marriage, the statute that forbade the Queen to wed without leave, the fury of the proud Duke who had hounded Owen to Newgate, the axe that had taken his head at Hereford, all of it had failed. In the end, to stop the quiet work that the love of the Queen and the servant had set in motion. There is a lesson in that worth dwelling on for a moment. The powers of the realm had done everything in their power to prevent and then to punish the marriage of Owen and Catherine. They had made a law against it. They had hounded Owen into sanctuary and prison. They had broken up his family and, at the very last, taken his head. By every measure of worldly power, the magnates had won and the Welsh servant had lost, again and again, until he lost his very life. And yet, the one thing they could not undo was the thing that mattered most, the children of that forbidden love and the blood that ran in them. All the law and the prisons and the axes in the kingdom could not unmake the marriage that had already borne its fruit, could not stop that fruit from ripening, in the fullness of time, into a king. The mightiest men of the age had set themselves against the love of a lonely queen and a Welsh servant, and the love had outlasted them all and conquered. It is one of those moments where the great public history of rulers and politics is quietly overturned by a private thing, a marriage made in secret for love, and where the patient working of blood and time proves stronger, in the end, than all the armies and the statutes of the mighty. From a queen's loneliness and a Welshman's daring had come a king, and from that king a dynasty, the House of Tudor, which would rule England for more than 100 years. Through Henry VII and his son Henry VIII and his granddaughter, the great Elizabeth, the most famous royal house the country has ever known. Think of the figures who would spring from Owen's blood. There was Henry VII, the careful and cunning king who founded the dynasty and brought peace to a war-torn realm. There was his son, Henry VIII, the towering and terrible king who broke with the Church of Rome, married 6 wives, and remade the religion of England by his own will. There was the boy King Edward and the 2 queens, Mary and then Elizabeth, daughters of Henry VIII, who ruled in their own right in an age that scarcely knew how to be ruled by women. And there was Elizabeth, above all, the last and greatest of the line, under whom England defeated the great armada of Spain, sent its ships across the oceans, and produced a flowering of poetry and drama that has never been surpassed. The age of the greatest writers the English tongue has known. All of them, this astonishing succession of monarchs who shaped England across more than 100 years, carried in their veins the blood of Owen Tudor, the Welsh servant beheaded at Hereford. From one obscure man, by a single daring act of love, there had sprung a whole line of sovereigns who would define an age. It is among the most extraordinary facts in all the long history of the English crown, and it rested, all of it, on a thread so fine that the wonder is it held at all, on a secret marriage that left no record, on the survival of a hunted boy, on the loyalty of a single steadfast man, on 100 chances that might have fallen the other way. Strip away any one of them, and the whole glittering succession of Tudor monarchs simply vanishes from history, never to be. That so much grandeur should have hung on so slender a thread, and that the thread should trace back, in the end, to the daring of one poor Welshman in a queen's household, is a thing to marvel at, and to remember on a quiet night, when the great public story of kings and crowns is revealed to have grown, like a mighty tree, from a single hidden seed. Owen Tudor, dead beneath the axe, beheaded as a traitor in a country marketplace, was the grandfather of the King of England, and the founder, though he never lived to know it, of a royal line that would shape the destiny of the nation. What, then, are we to make of Owen Tudor, this Welshman of fallen fortune, who lived so strange and daring a life? He was not a statesman, nor a famous warrior, nor a man who shaped events by his policies or his genius. He belongs, rather, to that curious company of people who change history almost by accident, not through any grand design or deliberate ambition for greatness, but through a single private act whose vast consequences they could never have foreseen. When Owen married Catherine, he was not setting out to found a dynasty or to alter the destiny of England. He was a man in love, reaching for happiness with a woman he adored, thinking surely of nothing grander than a life together. The dynasty, the kings, the closing of the medieval age, all of it flowed from that private act of love. But none of it was in Owen's mind or intention. He simply loved and married, and the rest unfolded across the generations after him, far beyond his sight or his imagining. There is something humbling in that. The thought that the greatest consequences may flow from the most private acts, that a man reaching only for love may set in motion the rise and fall of kingdoms. Owen Tudor did not mean to change history. He meant only to love a queen. But in loving her and daring to marry her, he became, without knowing it, one of the hidden hinges on which the whole future of his nation turned. He was, for most of his life, a man of no power at all, a servant, a fugitive, an old soldier on a losing side. And yet, by the single most important act of his life, by daring to love and to marry, where every law and every custom forbade it, he set in motion a chain of events that founded a dynasty and changed the history of England. His was a life ruled, above all, by a kind of reckless courage in the matter of the heart, the boldness to reach for a love so far above his station that any prudent man would have shrunk from it, and to hold to it through every danger that followed. It is that quality, more than any other, that defines him and sets him apart. The world he lived in rewarded caution, the careful keeping of one's place, the prudent acceptance of the station God had assigned. A wise man in Owen's position, a servant who found himself loved by a queen, would have drawn back in terror from so dangerous a prize, would have kept his head down and his heart guarded, and lived out a safe and obscure life. Owen did the opposite. He reached for the impossible thing, knowing what it might cost. And having reached for it, he held to it through prison and exile, and the long danger of his middle years, and at the last he gave his life still loyal to the cause his love had created. There was recklessness in it, certainly. A refusal to count the cost that a prudent man would call folly. But there was also a kind of greatness, the greatness of a man who would not let the walls of his world cage his heart, who dared to love and to act upon his love against every power arrayed against him. Most men live and die within the bounds their birth assigns them. Owen Tudor broke those bounds for love and changed the course of a kingdom in the breaking. And consider how far the consequences ran, spreading out from that single act across the centuries, like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. From his forbidden marriage came his sons, and from his sons a grandson who took the throne, and from that grandson a line of monarchs who ruled England through its passage out of the Middle Ages, who broke with Rome and remade its religion, who sent its ships across the oceans and laid the first foundations of an empire, who presided over a flowering of language and art that shaped the English tongue forever. The England that emerged from the age of the Tudors was a different country from the medieval realm that had beheaded Owen at Hereford, and the dynasty that wrought that change sprang, at its root, from a servant's love for a queen. The ripples of that one private act of daring spread out through the whole later history of the nation, touching the faith, the language, the very identity of England, in ways that Owen, kneeling at the block in a winter marketplace, could never have begun to imagine. It is humbling, and it is wonderful, to think that so much flowed from so little, that the whole vast aftertide of Tudor England had its source in the heart of a poor Welshman who dared to love above his station. The bounds he broke for love stayed broken, and a nation was changed. He paid for that boldness with years of imprisonment and flight, and at the very last with his life, kneeling for the axe in a Hereford street, with the memory of his queen upon his lips. And yet, set against all that he won, the price seems almost worth the paying. For consider what his daring bought, not for himself alone, but for the centuries after him. It bought the lives of his sons, the earls who rose from a hidden scandal to the heights of the realm. It bought the birth of his grandson, the king who would reconcile a riven kingdom and found a dynasty. It bought the whole age of the Tudors, with all its splendour and its terror and its glory. The England of the great queen and the great poets, the nation that turned its face toward the wider world. None of it would have existed had Owen not dared, in a queen's quiet household long before, to reach for a love that every law forbade him. He could not have known what he was setting in motion, could not have dreamed that his stolen happiness would echo down the centuries in the rise and fall of kings. He knew only that he loved, and that he would not let the walls of his realm keep him from his love, whatever it cost. The cost in the end was high, the years of danger, and the death in the marketplace. But the reward was a kind of immortality, the founding of a line that would never have been without him, and a place, secure forever, in the long story of his nation. Few men have ever bought so much with a single act of the heart, or paid for it so dearly, or left behind them out of so unlikely a life, so vast and lasting a mark upon the world. But he won, by that same boldness, a place in history that no servant could ever have dreamed of. the founder of the line of Tudor, the grandfather of kings. There is something in his story that speaks to the oldest of human hopes, that love might leap across every barrier the time erects, that the low might be lifted to the high, that a poor man's daring might echo down the centuries. These are the hopes that every age has cherished, and that the rigid order of the world so rarely satisfies. And that is perhaps why Owen's story has held its power across so many centuries. For most people in most ages have lived and died within the narrow bounds their birth assigned them, their loves and their ambitions hemmed in by walls of rank and custom and law that could not be climbed. And here is a man who climbed them, a servant of a conquered race, born under disabling laws, into a ruined family, who reached past every barrier of his realm to love a queen, to found a dynasty, to set his blood upon the throne of the very kingdom that had conquered his people. His life is a standing rebuke to the iron certainties of rank, a proof that the walls the world builds are not, in the end, as unscalable as they seem, that daring and love and the long patient working of time can carry a poor man's blood from a windswept island to a royal crown. It is a story that says the low may rise, that the forbidden may triumph, that the obscure may father kings, and that says it not as a fable, but as a thing that truly happened. And in an age like his, that crushed such hopes more often than it fulfilled them. The life of Owen Tudor stands out as the rare and shining exception, the dream made real. It is the kind of story that the people of his own age, who loved a tale of fortune's turning, would have cherished above almost any other. The poor man raised to greatness, the servant who won a queen, the conquered blood that came to rule. And it is the kind of tale we cherish still, for the same reasons, because it whispers to us that the time is not always as fixed as it seems, that the walls between high and low are not always unbreakable, that a single act of courage or love may set in motion consequences beyond all reckoning. That is why his tale has lasted, and why it is worth the telling on a night like this. The long, strange, daring journey of a Welshman of fallen fortune who reached for the impossible and against all the odds of his hard and rigid world took hold of it. And there is something, too, in the manner of his end, the old man washed and combed and ringed with candles by a stranger's hand, that gives his story, for all its drama, a strange and tender grace. And so we leave him there, in the candlelight of the Hereford marketplace, the old Welshman whose long journey took him from a windswept island in a conquered land to the bed of a queen and the company of kings, and, at the last, to a block of wood in a country town, his blood already on its way to the throne of England in the veins of a boy across the sea. It is a story of love and daring and loss, of a man who began with nothing and reached, in secret, for the highest and most forbidden prize his world could offer, and who founded, out of that one reckless act of the heart, a dynasty that would outlast him by 100 years. The Welshman of fallen fortune from Anglesey became the grandfather of the most famous royal house in English history, and the candles a poor woman lit around his severed head were, though no one there could have known it, burning around the head of the founder of the Tudors. Think how strange the truth of that moment was, hidden from everyone who stood in the Hereford square, to the soldiers and the townsfolk gathered there. This was simply the execution of a defeated old man. A traitor's death like 100 others in those merciless wars, a head set up as a warning and then forgotten. None of them could have known that they were looking at the founder of a dynasty, that the blood in that severed head would, within a single generation, sit upon the throne of England, that the grandson of this beheaded Welshman would close one age of the realm and open another. The future kings and queens who would spring from his line, the great Tudor sovereigns who would remake England, all of it lay coiled, unseen, in the moment of his death, invisible to every eye in that winter square. History was being made there. in the cold marketplace, and no one knew it. It is one of those moments that remind us how blind we are to the true meaning of the things we witness, how the seeds of vast futures may lie hidden in events that seem, to those who live through them, like nothing more than the small, grim business of an ordinary day. It is good, on a quiet night like this one, to remember him, Owen, and the long, strange, daring journey of his life. If these long nights and these old stories are something you would like to find your way back to, you are very welcome to stay a while in this company and to let this be a place you return to when the dark comes early and sleep is slow in coming. There is no need to do anything at all, not now. There is only the dark and the warmth and the long story behind you now, the windswept island and the Queen's quiet rooms and the secret marriage and the candles in the marketplace, all growing soft and far away. The old Welshman and his Queen sinking gently down into the deep well of the past where they belong. While you, here, now, safe and warm and far from all of it, let go of the day at last and drift towards sleep. Sleep well, stay warm, be kind to the people in your house, and I will see you in the next one. Good night.